You ever wake up planning to organize your life, then end up questioning reality instead? That was my morning. It had already defeated me, and it wasn't even lunchtime. I had coffee, a mountain of unfinished work, and absolutely zero intention of touching any of it. My schedule needed organizing. Supplies needed ordering. Paperwork was quietly multiplying to a mountain of future regret. Normally, someone else would have handled all of that before I even noticed it existed. She wasn't here anymore. Funny how grief works. It doesn't always make you cry. Sometimes it just convinces you that alphabetizing paperwork is a personal attack. As a therapist, I could diagnose my own behavior in seconds. Avoidance, attachment, unresolved loss. As a regular human being, I decided those sounded like tomorrow's problems. Then the bell above the front door chimed. Instantly, my body remembered I actually had a job. Showtime. I nearly launched my coffee into another dimension while scrambling to look like a competent professional. I jumped to my feet, straightened my tie, threw on my jacket, and stepped into the waiting room wearing the expression of a man who absolutely had his life together. I was lying. The performance had begun. Waiting for me were 5 clients. Actually, for women who looked like they'd each walked off the cover of entirely different fantasy novels. And one exhausted guy, standing in the middle, looking like he'd accidentally won a contest he desperately wanted to lose. Interesting. Very interesting. There was a towering orc built like she wrestled bears and bench presses carriages for exercise. An elegant elf whose calm gaze could probably judge my ancestors. A shy red-haired village girl trying to become invisible, and a princess radiating enough pride to tax the surrounding air. Then there was the young swordsman. No royal aura, no impossible beauty, just a tired face carrying the expression of someone who hadn't enjoyed a full night's sleep in months. Immediately, I became suspicious. Experience had taught me that the most normal-looking person in a fantasy world was usually hiding the biggest headache. I welcomed everyone inside and apologized for not having a secretary. That somehow led to explaining what a secretary actually was. Apparently, fantasy worlds can invent dragons, but office administration is where they draw the line. Then I asked the question every therapist secretly fears hearing answered. Were they individual appointments, or one session together? Every single one answered at once. Together. The synchronized response wasn't the worrying part. It was the way every woman immediately glared at the others afterward. Wonderful. That should have been my warning. Nothing says healthy relationship quite like making eye contact with 3 romantic rivals before anyone has even sat down. I offer drinks. The princess requested tea with royal elegance. Expected. The orc requested alcohol with the confidence of someone who considered barrels a serving size. Also expected. I didn't have ale, but desperate times produce creative therapists. A stronger substitute appeared from my cabinet. Looking at the size of the woman requesting it, I quietly upgraded the serving. Judging from her expression, she considered it a light snack. Professional ethics from my old world would probably be screaming right now. Good thing they couldn't cross dimensions. Once everyone settled, introductions somehow became their own adventure and were equally educational. The orc introduced herself with the confidence of an avalanche. The elf politely informed me that saying her full name would probably consume my remaining lifespan. The village girl barely whispered hers. The princess corrected my manners before she even finished introducing herself. Royalty really is a full-time occupation. Meanwhile, poor Zach, already looked like he'd rather fight another apocalypse than attend this appointment. The situation became obvious almost immediately. Every woman wanted the same man. None of them wanted each other. And somehow, the hero looked like the biggest victim in the room. I experienced the strangest emotion imaginable. Jealousy. Not because I wanted 4 women fighting over me. Actually, no, that was exactly why. Then my professional brain returned and reminded me that if 4 people are constantly competing for your attention, congratulations. You've unlocked stress with premium features. I explained that group relationship counseling wasn't exactly something I'd expected to practice after arriving in this world. Back home, this would have already been unusual. Here, apparently, it was Tuesday. I asked whether everyone felt dissatisfied. Every head nodded. That alone told me this wasn't a romance problem. It was a communication disaster wearing romance as a costume. Then each woman clarified something. None of them were interested in each other. Every road led back to Zach. The princess insisted she was only here because of duty. The orc practically challenged the others to survive competing with her. The elf quietly declared her loyalty. The village girl turned bright red before saying almost nothing. Meanwhile, poor Zach looked like a man attending his own execution. There was no way I could untangle this knot with everyone talking over one another. So I decided to separate the group and interview each person alone. Predictably, nobody loved that idea, especially the orc, who had already emptied her drink. She silently held out her glass for another refill. Honestly, I respected the commitment. After sending the others outside, I activated a soundproofing enchantment. Zach relaxed the instant the others were gone. That alone told me everything. Heroes apparently feared awkward conversations more than demon armies. Turns out he wasn't an another-world traveler, just the son of one. He'd grown up with Carol before leaving home to become an adventurer because of an ability to copy other people's powers. At first, I tried sounding impressed. Then he casually mentioned defeating the Demon King. Another one. At this point, I'd met so many legendary heroes that I was beginning to suspect Demon Kings reproduced faster than rabbits. Someone should really organize seasonal hunting permits. Nobody can tell me otherwise. The jokes disappeared when I asked how he actually felt. The smile left his face. He wasn't living every hero's dream. He was surviving every introvert's nightmare. Every sentence sounded like someone dropping another stone into an already overflowing backpack. One companion constantly demanded his attention. Another silently watched him like a beautifully decorated security camera. One secretly wanted him all to herself. The princess expected royal treatment around the clock. Forget saving the world. The real final boss was everyone's expectations. Classic. The strongest heroes usually lose to conversations. For the first time that morning, my envy disappeared. Underneath, all the admiration sat an exhausted young man. The tragic part, he never told any of them, because disappointing people scared him more than monsters ever did. Never considered ending any relationship. Never risked making anyone unhappy. Classic people pleaser. I quietly wrote one diagnosis. Then I asked the question that froze him. If someone chose to leave you, would you let them? His answer came without hesitation. Of course. He wanted everyone to stay only if they truly wanted to. Then, almost like confessing a crime, he admitted something else. If one of them walked away, he might finally get some sleep. That single sentence explained more than everything else he'd told me. Then I asked the most dangerous question imaginable. Did he have a favorite? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. It's like his brain immediately disconnected from his mouth. Smart man. Sometimes silence has a much higher survival rate than honesty. The interview ended peacefully. He opened the door, standing directly outside. The elf, completely motionless, as if she'd been waiting there the entire time. Not even blinking. I've counseled vampires with healthier personal boundaries. She stared only at Zach. He didn't even react, which somehow made the whole situation even creepier. I smiled an awkward smile anyway. Something told me this counseling session had barely begun. Inside, I quietly accepted that this wasn't therapy anymore. It was survival. There are few things in life more unsettling than opening a door and finding someone already standing on the other side, especially when they haven't blinked in what appears to be several business days. The elf stood there in complete silence, staring past me and directly at Zach with the intensity of someone trying to memorize his soul for future reference. Zach, meanwhile, reacted the way one might react to seeing a familiar chair. Interesting. Either he'd grown accustomed to this behavior, or I was severely underestimating what counted as normal among adventuring parties. I invited her inside. Serenitia sat with perfect posture, hands folded neatly in her lap. Like most elves, She possessed that unnerving stillness that made me feel less like I was conducting a counseling session and more like I was being evaluated for weaknesses. She barely blinked. I've met statues with more expressive faces. Still, I'd treated enough elves to know this wasn't hostility. Probably. I began with the obvious question. How had she met Zack? Simple enough. Apparently, he'd entered her family's forest seeking aid during his quest against the Demon King. Naturally, she'd accompanied him. Naturally, at this point, joined a handsome hero on a world-saving adventure was becoming the fantasy equivalent of meeting someone at a coffee shop. Then I asked when she'd fallen in love with him. No, that was her answer. Interesting. I adjusted my approach. Had it happened gradually? No. Suddenly? No. Had he done something heroic? Romantic? Particularly memorable? No. By this point, I was beginning to suspect I was interviewing a very beautiful brick wall. Finally, I asked her to elaborate. And then, everything suddenly made sense. Well, made sense might be overselling it. Apparently, during their battle against one of the Demon King's generals, she'd been struck by a curse designed to force her into loving the first person she saw. Unfortunately, for everyone involved, that person had been Zack. I sat there for several seconds in silence. Not because I was shocked, because I'd spent the last hour mentally preparing for a complicated love triangle, only to discover I'd been outmaneuvered by magical workplace harassment. Fantasy worlds are exhausting. The truly tragic part wasn't the curse itself. It was that she'd never told him, because she didn't want to hurt him. There was again, people making themselves miserable in the name of protecting someone else's feelings. Therapists call that unhealthy. Romantic protagonists call it Tuesday. When I asked whether she'd prefer to be free of the curse, she said nothing. She didn't have to. I've spent enough time around grieving people to recognize silence when it's screaming. Thankfully, unlike most emotional problems, this one could be solved with paperwork. I wrote a note to an old acquaintance and handed it to a passing pixie along with a piece of honey candy. There are many things I still haven't gotten used to in this world. The Postal Service being comprised of tiny winged women with a sugar addiction remains near the top of the list. That should be resolved by the end of the day. Honestly, I wish all my patients' problems could be fixed with enchanted mail. Unfortunately, reality rarely extends such courtesies. Next came Crush, who had somehow finished her third drink. At this point, I was becoming increasingly convinced I could fill her cup directly from a river, and she'd ask for seconds. There was a pleasant flush on her cheeks as she spoke about meeting Zack in battle. Apparently, he'd earned her respect through single combat. Reasonable. Then I asked when she'd fallen in love with him. She looked genuinely confused. You think I love him? That should have been my warning. Apparently, Crush wasn't motivated by romance, or companionship, or emotional attachment. No, she simply wished to have the strongest possible child. And after evaluating the available candidates, Zack had apparently won. Congratulations, Zack. You've successfully become fantasy genetics. She explained this with the same casual tone one might use when discussing weather patterns. Once she had a child, she intended to leave. Also, and I cannot stress enough how casually she revealed this, she didn't even consider him her type. Poor Zack. Imagine defeating the Demon King only to discover you've been promoted to acceptable breeding stock. Heroes really don't get enough support. I asked whether she communicated any of this. Apparently she had. Repeatedly. Unfortunately, Zack kept avoiding the situation. Interesting. One woman loved him against her will. Another didn't love him at all. And somehow, things were only becoming more complicated. Classic. The princess was next. Princess Gralia accepted her tea with all the dignity one would expect from royalty and all the warmth of an annual tax audit. I poured myself a cup as well. I preferred coffee, but the tea had been purchased by Katrina before she... No, not now. Grief is an inconsiderate thing. It doesn't care whether you're counseling heroes or pouring tea. It simply waits for quiet moments and slips a knife between your ribs. I recovered before the princess could comment. Barely. She explained she'd met Zack after his victories against the Demon King's forces and had joined him because she didn't trust him or his companions to finish the job. Which, translated from royal into common, roughly meant. I liked him immediately and lacked the emotional tools to process it. Years of therapy have made me surprisingly fluent. When I asked if she'd leave him if released from her engagement, her face turned red so quickly I briefly considered checking for fever. The answer, of course, was no. Not that she'd admit it. Royalty and emotional honesty appear to be natural enemies. Still, I allowed her the dignity of pretending. Therapy isn't about forcing people to confront the truth. It's about gently placing the truth in front of them and waiting for them to stop pretending they don't see it. Then came Carol. Of everyone present, she seemed the most uncomfortable, like she'd somehow wandered into the wrong building and was too polite to leave. She told me she'd known Zach since childhood, and when I asked when she'd fallen for him, she smiled. Apparently, her future had been children are strange. Love is stranger. Her older brother had been chasing her with a frog. Zach had retaliated, heroically. Somewhere out there, bards sing songs about dragons and ancient evils, when apparently they should have been documenting amphibious warfare. Unlike the others, Carol's feelings were painfully simple. She didn't want glory, or titles, or children. She just wanted him to rest. That one hurt a little, because sometimes love isn't grand. Sometimes it's just looking at an exhausted person and wishing the world would be kinder to them. Interesting. 3 women. 3 entirely different kinds of love. And one increasingly overwhelmed hero trapped in the middle. Eventually, I invited everyone back inside. The couch somehow seemed smaller now. Or perhaps the collective emotional baggage had simply taken up additional space. Then came a tapping at my window. Perfect timing. The Pixie had returned. Honestly, I trust the local Pixie delivery service more than I ever trusted human postal systems. Less paperwork. More wings. I read the note she delivered, lit a candle, and activated the spell. Purple sparks danced across the room as ancient magic settled over Serenitia. Then, black smoke escaped from her nose, ears, and mouth. You know, there are some things you never entirely get used to seeing. That ranks highly among them. A moment later, she stood and smiled. A real smile. The kind that reaches someone's eyes. The curse is gone. Silence filled the room. Zach looked less heartbroken than confused, which was fair. Finding out someone only loved you because of dark magic has to be an unusual Tuesday. She thanked me, wished everyone a pleasant several centuries apart, and promptly left. Honestly, understandable. If I ever spent months magically in love with someone against my will, I'd probably relocate continents. Then came the difficult part. The problem, I explained, is communication. As it turns out, this is also the answer to roughly 90% of all therapy. Then I addressed Crush's situation. The room immediately descended into chaos. Carol protested. The princess nearly short-circuited from indignation. Zach looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Meanwhile, Crush laughed so hard, I briefly worried about structural damage. Therapy, I've discovered, is significantly louder in fantasy worlds. Eventually, the truth emerged. One companion had never loved him. One only wanted his child. And the remaining 2, well, their faces turned red enough to answer that question for me. I pointed this out. The princess denied everything immediately. Naturally, at this point, I was fairly certain she could confess her love while actively writing poetry about him and still insist it was merely a matter of royal duty. Some habits die hard. By the end of the session, we'd solved approximately half their problems, which, considering where we'd started, felt nothing short of miraculous. I scheduled another appointment for the following week. Because some issues require time, others require honesty. And these people required both in alarming quantities. As everyone prepared to leave, Crush declared she liked me. High praise, coming from someone who viewed combat as a valid introduction. I smiled politely. After all, giving advice has always been the easy part. Following it, well, that was a conversation I continued avoiding every time I looked at an empty desk. And somehow, I had a feeling my own unresolved problems were about to become considerably harder to ignore. If there's one thing I've learned about people who get transported to another world, It's that eventually someone suggests starting a support group. If there's a second thing I've learned, it's that therapists somehow end up volunteering to run it. Looking back, I'm still not entirely sure whether that was a noble decision or an incredibly sophisticated form of self-sabotage. Every week, I'd stand in front of a circle of people who had all lost their old lives in one spectacularly inconvenient way or another. Smile warmly, pretend I wasn't emotionally running on fumes, and begin exactly the same way. Routine is comforting, especially when your entire existence stopped making sense months ago. My name is John. The introduction practically recited itself. Back on Earth, I'd been a therapist. Now, I was still a therapist, just with significantly more dragons. I explained how I'd wandered into what I thought was an innocent ring of mushrooms during a walk, only to discover the universe apparently had an aggressively literal interpretation of touching grass. Turns out it wasn't a mushroom circle. It was magical public transportation. No ticket required. No return trip available. I still remember stumbling through unfamiliar woods while my brain desperately insisted everything was normal. The trees looked wrong. The air smelled different. Even the sky seemed off. And yet my mind refused to connect the dots. Denial really is the strongest survival instinct. Unfortunately, so are monsters. I didn't begin my new life by discovering hidden powers, or drawing a legendary sword, or impressing beautiful strangers. No. I spent my first hour getting chased up a tree by tiny homicidal creatures throwing rocks at me. Heroic. Very heroic. Thankfully, an adventurer eventually wandered by and rescued me before I became woodland target practice. From there, everything slowly improved. Mostly, I'd build a life, open a practice, found people willing to help, found people willing to need help, and somewhere along the way, this little support group became my weekly reminder that I wasn't the only person whose life had been derailed by magic. The regulars politely applauded, mostly because they knew that if they didn't, I'd probably tell the story anyway. The newcomer beside me stayed quiet. Poor thing. I remembered that silence. It isn't shyness. It's the sound your entire identity makes while trying to rebuild itself. I smiled and invited everyone else to introduce themselves. Then came Eric. Eric had once exterminated pests for a living. Back on Earth. Now he mostly argued with fantasy ethics. He explained that his journey to another world had begun exactly the way so many others apparently did. A truck, of course. Honestly, at this point, I was convinced there was a secret union of interdimensional truck drivers. Somewhere out there, Truck Cohen was probably Employee of the Month for the 12,000th consecutive century. The man had an unbelievable work ethic. Eric explained he'd tried continuing his extermination business here, only to discover fantasy societies become deeply offended when you eliminate dangerous creatures with poison instead of dramatically hitting them with enchanted sticks. Apparently, stabbing monsters to death is honorable. Using effective pest control, now that's crossing the line. Civilizations are weird. His final confession was that he missed cheap beer. Honestly, that was probably the most relatable sentence of the afternoon. Next came Ben, or, as he repeatedly reminded everyone, Hot Benny's. Back on Earth, he'd been the attractive member of a famous band. Emphasis on had been. Now he resembled a gigantic boar with enough muscle to intimidate furniture. His story somehow involved an angry groupie, internet witchcraft, and waking up transformed into something that looked capable of bench-pressing taverns. I've stopped questioning how curses work. They've stopped making sense. Ben mourned the loss of his dating life with the passion of a Shakespearean tragedy. Unfortunately, that remained the only topic he showed genuine enthusiasm for discussing. I'd spent months trying to help him process his grief. He'd spent months ignoring every piece of advice I offered. Therapists aren't supposed to have favorite patients. We're also not supposed to have patients who make us consider charging extra for emotional property damage. Then Sarah stood. Former comedian, current serving girl, professional owner of the quickest tongue in the room. She'd also arrived courtesy of an unfortunate encounter with, you guessed it, another truck. Honestly, The transport department between worlds really needs to diversify its recruitment methods. Magic portals, ancient relics, summoning rituals. Surely there are alternatives besides heavy commercial vehicles. Sarah joked that none of her comedy material worked anymore because nobody here understood airplanes, politicians, or modern life. Instead, local comedians apparently relied on juggling and loots. Imagine spending years perfecting stand-up, only to lose your audience to a man aggressively playing medieval background music. She somehow managed to make everyone laugh anyway. Even me, which, admittedly, wasn't a particularly high bar after the week I'd been having. Ben grumbled when she took another playful jab at him. Fair. She wasn't exactly aiming above the belt. Then came Renee. Renee always fascinated me. Unlike the rest of us, he hadn't traveled from another world. He'd traveled from another time. A French reconnaissance pilot from the First World War. One strange light in the sky later, he found himself flying beneath unfamiliar stars while an actual dragon intercepted him. Thankfully, the dragon turned out to possess better conflict resolution skills than most people I've counseled. Instead of eating him, it safely landed both him and his aircraft outside Avalon. Honestly, that's still one of the nicest first contact stories I've ever heard. He quietly admitted he was relieved humanity had eventually won both world wars. Eric immediately attempted to begin his weekly debate about which country deserved the most credit. I cut him off before international diplomacy became this week's therapy topic. Again, there are some arguments no amount of counseling can fix. After that, several occasional members shared their stories. Some had adjusted remarks, others were still quietly mourning lives nobody else in this world remembered. That's the strange thing about being Isekai. People assume the hardest part is surviving monsters. It isn't. It's grieving a home that's still out there, without you. Eventually, only one person remained. The newcomer. She looked painfully uncomfortable. Pale, quiet, eyes fixed firmly on the floor, as though looking up might somehow make this place more real. I asked whether she'd like to introduce herself. She softly declined. Interesting. Not defensive. Not hostile. Just not ready. I recognized that feeling immediately. Some wounds don't heal faster because strangers are waiting politely. I smiled, told her she could take all the time she needed. Sometimes the greatest kindness a therapist can offer is permission not to speak. Besides, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to ending the session. My apartment, my bed, and my unresolved emotional baggage were calling my name. So I clapped my hands together. Let's take a break for tea and pastries. Simple enough. Or, at least, that's what I believed. Looking back, I really should have known the quietest person in the room was about to become the biggest mystery of them all. Chapter 3 Script. I kept telling myself I attended these support group meetings for everyone else's sake. That was only partially true. The other part was that listening to other people's problems occasionally distracted me from my own. Not a healthy coping mechanism. But therapists are surprisingly talented at recognizing unhealthy behavior and filing it under deal with later. After the introductions ended and the room dissolved into smaller conversations, I made my way toward the refreshments table. Support groups apparently operate under universal laws. Rule number 1, coffee is never available when you need it. Rule number 2, the pastries are always stale. Doesn't matter if you're in New York, London, or a city populated by elves and dragon enthusiasts. Some constants transcend dimensions. I picked up a pastry that could probably qualify as construction material and pour myself some tea. The tea was excellent, which somehow made me resent it. I miss coffee, not just drinking it, the ritual of it, grinding the beans, the smell filling the kitchen, the quiet moments before the rest of the world remembered I existed. It's strange what grief chooses to preserve. You don't always miss the important moments. Sometimes you miss the sound of a coffee press at 6 in the morning. Dangerous thought. I'd hosted enough support groups to know where the I miss road eventually leads. It's a very long road, and somehow every destination is sadness. So I changed the subject. Internally, therapists do that a lot. I retreated to my usual corner and watched everyone settle into familiar patterns. Sarah had already gathered an audience. Of course she had. Within minutes, she had half the room laughing hard enough to spill tea across the floor. Back on Earth, she'd almost had a comedy special. Here, she was competing against lute players and men who could literally breathe fire. Talk about a difficult entertainment market. Eric sat alone with enough pastries stacked on his plate to suggest he'd mistaken refreshments for competitive eating. At this point, I was beginning to suspect he attended less for emotional support and more because free food existed. Frankly, I respected the hustle. Ben was complaining. Naturally, if silence ever broke out across Avalon, I was reasonably certain Ben would appear moments later to explain why women didn't appreciate him. Renee, meanwhile, listened with the patience of a saint, or a man who had survived trench warfare and therefore considered this comparatively manageable. I looked around for the new girl. Nothing. No dark hair. No pale face. No sign she'd ever been there at all. That immediately bothered me. People don't simply vanish in fantasy cities. Actually, correction. People absolutely vanish in fantasy cities, which is somehow worse. I'd ask around later. The face stipend I received mostly went toward helping other displaced people anyway. If she needed assistance, I'd find her. Eventually, hopefully before a cult did. Fantasy worlds have an alarming number of cults. Since nobody currently required my professional expertise, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a flyer I'd picked up on the walkover. I'd spent the last 20 minutes debating whether showing it to Ben qualified as helping or cruel and unusual punishment. Only one way to find out. I approached Ben and Renee. Ben was mid-complaint. Again, they don't even look at me the same way anymore. Given that he was an 8-foot-4 man, that was objectively true. Some observations are best kept to yourself. I found something that might interest you, I said, handing him the flyer. His eyes narrowed as he read. Hourglass courtship, a singles event, 5-minute conversations, potential romance. Honestly, whoever named it deserved a raise. Fantasy taverns really understood branding. Ben's expression slowly transformed into the same look people make when informed they'll require surgery. I don't know. Ben, I interrupted gently. You spent an entire year explaining that you want to meet someone. His ears twitched. That isn't what I said. True. His wording had generally been less poetic. This guarantees 5 uninterrupted minutes of conversation. They'll hate me. That's impossible. They don't know you well enough yet. Renee accidentally snorted into his tea. I pretended not to notice. Ben looked genuinely miserable, which, admittedly, wasn't unusual. Then I made a terrible decision. I'll go with you. The words left my mouth before my survival instincts could stop them. Immediately, I regretted everything. Really? Ben asked. No, absolutely not. Of course. Therapists should receive hazard pay. I'll attend as well, Renee added quietly. I blinked. That surprised me. Renee looked embarrassed. I didn't exactly have many opportunities to meet women before. Well, he gestured vaguely toward history itself. Fair point. World wars are famously bad for dating. Suddenly, this wasn't just me escorting Ben to a social event. This was becoming an outing. An awful, terrible, potentially entertaining outing. Ben released a defeated sigh. Fine. Victory. Pyrrhic victory. But victory nonetheless. I patted his arm. Proud of you. He looked offended by the sentiment. Honestly, progress. The meeting wrapped up shortly afterward. As always, nearly everyone vanished the moment cleanup became necessary. Some traditions truly are universal. Thankfully, Renee stayed behind. He always did. Together, we packed away chairs and wrapped leftover pastries in oversized leaves. I saw a person today with a snake tail, he said suddenly. What they call? Naga. And the purple woman with one eye and a horn where her nose should be. I paused. You know what? No idea. Even after all this time, Avalon still occasionally produced people that made me question whether reality was improvising. Just use her name, I advised. That's usually the safest option. Renee nodded thoughtfully. Unlike the rest of us, he'd arrived here without decades of fantasy stories as reference material. He'd never heard of elves, or orcs, We're dwarves. Imagine learning dragons exist before learning what a dragon is. Must have been a difficult week. Eventually, we finished cleaning. Outside, the city glowed beneath floating enchanted lanterns. I already regret agreeing to this courtship event, Renee admitted. That makes two of us. Three, technically. Ben had probably started regretting it before agreeing. I simply don't know if it's right, he continued quietly. There's someone waiting for me back home. Ah, there it was. Grief again. Always waiting around corners. I know. He looked toward the night sky. I just don't know if I'll ever see her again. Neither of us spoke for a moment. There are some questions therapists never answer, because we're still asking them ourselves. Maybe you'll have fun, I said finally. And if not, then we'll watch Ben accidentally insult someone? Exactly. That earned a laugh. Small victories. We said our goodbyes and parted ways. My walk home took me past the thirsty Drake. For a moment, I considered stopping, having a drink, pretending I was the sort of person who made spontaneous decisions. She would have encouraged it. I would have said no. Some things don't change, even after losing the person who knew you best. So I kept walking. My apartment sat inside a massive tree because apparently I'd spent my entire childhood imagining fantasy worlds and forgotten to specify practical architecture. The Fae had paid for it, along with my stipend. Apparently, accidentally kidnapping someone across dimensions comes with compensation packages. Good to know. Unfortunately, returning me home wasn't included. I climbed the grown staircase to my apartment and whispered the command word for the lights. Home. Small kitchen. Too many flowers. Furniture trying very hard to be from Earth. And a hammock. Because if life gives you magical tree apartments, you buy a hammock. It's the law. I put away the leftover pastries, changed clothes, and climbed into bed. The room went dark with another whispered command. Back and forth. Back and forth. The hammock swayed gently beneath me. And in the silence, I found myself missing traffic. Can you imagine that? Of all the things to miss. Car horns. Sirens. People yelling at each other 3 blocks away. And her. Mostly her. The warmth of Katrina's head resting against my chest. The way she'd steal my coffee when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I closed my eyes. Therapists are very good at helping other people process grief. We're significantly worse at doing it ourselves. Somewhere between one breath and the next. Sleep finally found me. And for the first time in days, I didn't dream about home. I dreamed about speed dating with a depressed poor man. Honestly, the morning ritual is sacred, even in a city that defies the laws of physics. Avalon is a beautiful disaster of architecture, but doesn't do mornings particularly well. Water dripping from a leaf onto my forehead, that's not an alarm clock. That's a tactical strike from nature. I rolled out of the hammock, feeling every bit of the exhaustion that had followed me into my dreams. Back home, I would have smashed a phone alarm into a wall. Here, I just resigned myself to the fact that the universe was playing a prank on me. I made my way to the bathroom, staring at a man who clearly needed more sleep and less interdimensional travel. I practiced my smiles in the mirror. The professional, the empathetic, the suggestive. I caught myself doing that last one and laughed. If I ever pulled that look at the thirsty Drake, I'd probably be laughed out of the building. Stick to the script, John. Stick to the subdued. The shower was a marvel of modern magic. Almond soap, heating runes, and a direct portal to the plane of water. It was almost perfect, except that if I stayed still for too long, my mind would drift. Katrina, the coffee she used to hand me. The way the silence in the apartment felt heavier when I wasn't moving. I finished quickly. Uniform time. Green checkered suit. Crisp white shirt. Brown shoes. It was my armor. My brand. My way of pretending I was still the man who lived on Earth, even though I was now a resident of a tree apartment in a city where dragons were a legitimate traffic hazard. I walked outside, nodding to a Minotaur dad who looked as tired as I felt. I ducked under a low-flying dragon. Seriously, someone needs to regulate the airspace, and made a beeline for Hilda's. Mia was behind the counter, looking like she'd just raided a goth magazine from 1,000 years in the future. She was the brightest thing in the neighborhood. Morning, John. Try something new. I'm all right, Mia. You'll have to try something else eventually. I gave her my best professional smile. Eventually? Yes. She's right, of course. Everything changes eventually. Even the grief. Even the routine. I made it back to the office, the door-opening ritual, the kettle, the press. The coffee was rich, dark, and warm. Almost good enough to forget that I was alone. Almost. I sat down, staring at my pathetic excuse for a schedule. Nos Treebeard. Dwarf. Phobia of something. And then, the secretary's search. I'm a therapist, not an administrator. Without someone to manage the chaos, my desk turns into a graveyard of scrap paper and missed appointments. I took a bite of a bagel, still warm, still perfect, and washed it down with a sip of coffee. I was almost reaching a state of professional zen. Then came a sound. A door slammed. A symphony of crashes. A spilled drink. A frantic scramble for laundry potion. My life in a nutshell. Moments of peace, interrupted by the chaotic reality of fantasy life. I wiped the coffee stain from my shirt. I straightened my tie. I walked toward the waiting room. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to be a normal Tuesday. I opened the door. Showtime. The crash was aggressive. I pushed open the waiting room door, kettle in hand, only to find the rug in total disarray. The small coffee table was vibrating with an intensity usually reserved for minor tectonic shifts, with two sturdy, panic-stricken dwarven boots protruding from underneath. It was Nos Treebeard. He didn't need an introduction, and he certainly didn't need to be coaxed out. He was terrified of the sky, a paralyzing, irrational fear of drifting into the void that defied every bit of dwarven logic. He'd spent his journey here buried beneath wooden crates in his uncle's wagon, staring at the floor, white-knuckling his way into my office. He looked ashamed. The fourth son of a mountain clan, brought here to apprentice, only to find himself paralyzed by the simple act of looking up. I sat on the floor, keeping my distance. I told him he wasn't alone. Humans have been battling irrational phobias for as long as we'd had consciousness, and there was no shame in the struggle. When he asked about a magical quick fix, I offered the only honest appraisal I had. He could certainly hunt for a high-priced miracle, but I offered a different kind of value, patience, and a significantly lower bill. He liked the deal. I closed the curtains. Avalon's architecture is a geographic nightmare, and the drop from the back balcony into the open air of the city is enough to break anyone with a fear of falling. With the sky successfully blocked out, Nos finally crawled out. He drank a cup of mushroom tea, a gift from a previous patient, and listened as I outlined the plan. No magic spells to erase his personality, just a mild tincture from Herb the Alchemist to blunt the sharpest edges of his anxiety, combined with the slow, grueling process of exposure therapy. Small, controlled steps. Gradual desensitization. A year of hard work to reclaim the sunlight. He took it well. He was trembling, but determined. We shook hands. His grip was like a vice, and he looked toward the door with visible dread. He'd made it from the wagon to the office, a massive victory in itself. Now he just had to survive the walk back. It was a start. In a city of monsters, magic, and impossible skies, sometimes simply walking through a door is the bravest thing a man can do. The support group was gone, and my office was back to its usual state of quiet, disorganized chaos. I watched Nos head back to his uncle's wagon, his stride steadier beneath that oversized umbrella. It was a victory, but I didn't have time to savor it. I had a secretary position to fill, and in a city like Avalon, hiring help wasn't just a matter of checking resumes. It was a survival exercise. The first candidate was a green-scaled kobold named Klept. He was bright, eager, and carried a set of pockets that defied the laws of physics. By the time I turned around to prepare his tea, he had managed to liberate a pen, a stapler, and my favorite letter opener. I had to call on Mark, a local guard, to escort him out while he was still busy trying to pry my window out of the wall. The second was Dame Cecily, a high-ranking member of the summer court. She arrived in a cloud of glitter and professional charm, gliding across the room on butterfly wings. She was a master of the double entendre, a classic fey tactic designed to trick the unwary into surrendering their names or their autonomy. I spent the entire interview playing a dangerous game of linguistic dodgeball, careful not to sign any slips of paper or offer anything more than my professional services. She was talented, certainly, but having a bored, high-ranking fae as an assistant would be like keeping a thunderstorm in a filing cabinet. I declined her offer, ignoring the microscopic fine print on the parking validation form she tried to foist upon me. By the time the third candidate arrived, I was drained. Andressa looked professional. Sharp suit, dark pumps, horns that hinted at her demonic origin. She wasn't just a demon. She was a predator. She wanted rare teas and immediately claimed my desk as her own. She was honest about her nature, a succubus who thrived on the ambient anxiety of my patients. It was a risky move, but I looked at my desk, covered in disorganized scraps of paper, and then at her. She was efficient, she was terrifying, and she was already anticipating the next move. I hired her on one condition. My clients were off limits for active provocation. As for me, I told her she could bother me as much as she wanted, provided the schedule stayed managed. She smiled. It was a dangerous, sharp-fang thing. I had a feeling I might have just traded one kind of chaos for another, but for the first time in weeks, my calendar was starting to look like it might actually be organized. Hilda's Bakery is the closest thing I have to a moral compass, mostly because the sugar content is the only thing keeping my brain functioning. Mia was sporting a fishnet top, literal netting that still smelled like the ocean, and pushing scones from a failed tea party. I bought them. A new secretary is a wild card, and I didn't know if Andressa, my new demonic hire, survived on soul-crushing bureaucracy or actual sustenance. When I reached the office, I found Andressa already settled in. She'd made off with the spare key, of course. She seemed genuinely pleased when I handed her the scones, though she reminded me that while bread fed the body, it was the anxiety and discomfort of my patients that fed her spirit. Fair point. I'd have to start charging my patients for her meals. She had already organized the entire month's schedule. It was sitting right on the desk under a pile labeled for John. I chose not to comment on the fact that I'd been blind to it for weeks. Then came Fabinaccio. The bard was a walking, talking cliché of the fantasy adventuring life. He had the golden eyes, the calloused fingers, and a reputation that spanned a dozen worlds. But beneath the peacock feathers and the bravado, he was hollowed out. He was tired of the character. His friends expected him to seduce dragons and pose in blizzards. His fans expected him to be the quintessential, upbeat body legend. He felt like a caricature, trapped in a public persona that had absolutely nothing to do with the man underneath. I gave him the standard therapy spiel: communication. I told him that if his friends were the people he trusted with his life in dungeons and against gorgons, they were the people he could trust with his truth. Then, I made a fatal error. I brought up the Earth celebrity phenomenon, how stars try to shock the public into seeing the real them by radically changing their image. I was trying to warn him against it. I was trying to talk about the dangers of reactive, desperate pivots. He didn't hear a warning. He heard a game plan. He bolted out of his seat with the intensity of a man who'd just discovered fire. Before I could finish my sentence, he was halfway out the door, fueled by a new, dangerous artistic direction. I groaned, sliding my hand down my face. I looked over at Andressa. She was a deep, vibrant crimson, clearly having feasted on the absolute buffet of anxiety and chaos I'd just unleashed upon the world. She giggled. I have a feeling I'm going to spend the rest of the week doing damage control on Fabinaccio's authentic new persona. But, as Andressa, the Thirsty Drake was a masterclass in atmospheric dissonance. Cherry wood curves, wildflowers growing from the rafters, and an earthy scent that clashed beautifully with the floral aroma of the mixed drinks. I was in my finest suit, dark green, with a subtle leaf pattern that only revealed itself if you were looking closely. It was time for the hourglass courtship. I found Renee and Ben near the bar. Ben was already leaning too far into his charming persona, which, in his case, mostly involved leering at strangers. I managed to steer him toward the seating row just as the night elf organizer rang her silver bell. The mechanics were simple: 5 minutes per conversation, then rotate. I ended up across from a dizzying array of personalities. There was Tyr Issa, a goblin who treated romance like an appraisal, calculating my value in cows and direwolf teeth. There was an ogress who politely informed me that dating me would be a fatal error for my constitution, which was probably the most responsible thing anyone had said to me all night. Then there was Crush. The Orcish war chief was back, sporting a new, aggressive confidence. She'd confirmed her pregnancy with Zach's child, and with that heir secured, she was actively shopping for a permanent partner. She looked me over, decided I was too fragile, and went back to scratching the bearhead cloak on her shoulder. The vampire, Lady Lucinda, was the real test. She was all velvet, silk, and fangs, and she made it clear within 10 seconds that she wanted to skip the courtship entirely and move straight to the feeding. I invoked the name of a local deity and claimed premarital chastity to get her off my neck. It was a lie, but it worked wonders. The final bell brought me face to face with Andressa. She was there, too, glowing a vibrant, predatory red, feeding on the ambient anxiety of every man in the room. She was working the crowd like a buffet, pulling every trick from the succubus playbook to keep her energy levels topped up. When I asked if she was genuinely looking for a connection, she didn't have an answer. Neither did I. When the night ended, we gathered at the bar to compare notes. Ben had struck out with the dear woman, who had taken exception to his attempts at clever humor and doused him in a cocktail. Renee had actually hit it off with a dwarven mechanic. I ended up with 6 slips of paper in my envelope. I looked down at the names, then back at my friends. Ben was still trying to borrow money for a cow-based dowry for a goblin I hadn't met, and Renee was nursing his drink, looking genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. I felt a strange, quiet warmth settle in my chest. It was the kind of night Katrina used to nag me about for years, the get out there night. I'd done it. I'd faced the void, managed the awkwardness, and actually put myself back in circulation. I didn't know if I call any of those 6 names, but for the first time since arriving in Avalon, I didn't feel like a ghost drifting through a city of strangers. I felt like a participant. The weekend in Avalon is a fickle thing, shifting between 2 and 3 days at the whim of the universe. This time, I caught a 3-day stretch, a mercy, given that my previous night at the Hourglass courtship left me feeling like I'd just survived an emotional car crash. I spent the morning on my balcony, nursing coffee and watching the local wildlife. Harpies were playing catch. A young dragon was practicing his dives with all the grace of a falling piano, and the local gargoyles were clearly skipping work again. It was a nice, grounded view, or as grounded as you can get when your apartment is inside a tree that occasionally decides to grow another floor. I ditched the tie, left 2 buttons undone on my green suit, and grabbed 2 macaroons Andressa hadn't finished. I wasn't sure if a demon needed a sugar rush, but I was definitely going to need one to survive the infinite library. The library is a geographic troll. Last time it was a spiraling tower. Today, it was a squat, boring concrete block that looked like it had been teleported directly from suburban Ohio. I deposited my stack of books with the origami librarians, little humanoid paper people covered in tiny, shifting script. They don't talk, but they are exceptionally good at shaming you for returning books late, which is a lot more terrifying than a late fee. I wandered the aisles, letting the library's curation system guide me. It nudged me past rows of Lich Kingdom romance and books on how to date a werewolf, which I'm fairly certain is just a manual on how to get bitten or accidentally murdered. I eventually bumped into Mia from the bakery. She was lugging around a stack of books that looked like a localized library disaster, accompanied by friends who looked like they'd been dressed by a time-traveling, angst-ridden punk band. I made a mental note to buy some monster romance novels off her next week. If I have to share an office with a succubus, I might as well keep her distracted with how to seduce a skull-headed monster instead of letting her feast on my own existential dread. I finally found my sanctuary, the old man airport fiction section. Tom Clinky, Jack Ranger, alternate world versions of the same thrillers I used to read on planes back home. There is a profound, meditative beauty in reading about men who handle international espionage without once having to worry about an orc drinking their entire liquor supply or a bard deciding to reinvent his entire personality as a dark art experiment. The origami librarian gave me a text-based "see you next week" that flickered in a dozen different fonts, and I headed out. The plan was simple: a massive stack of Orsish barbecue, a pile of pulpy novels, and 3 days of total isolation. I might be a therapist for the magically traumatized, but even I need a break from reality. Especially when reality is currently obsessed with whether or not it's socially acceptable for a goblin to accept it. The morning began with a calculated attempt at bribery. I dropped a bag of bunny-shaped cinnamon buns on Andressa's desk, hoping the sheer sugar density would buy me some professional distance. She accepted the offering with a knowing, predatory smirk, though her eyes quickly wandered to my bag, fishing out bedded by the beast. The ensuing mutual blush, my sheepish embarrassment clashing with her delighted, crimson-tinted triumph, was a conversation I was happy to end by retreating into my office. My next clients arrived with the grace of a hurricane. Prince Roderick, a man whose jawline was strong enough to crush stone, and Princess Sabada, who wore enough sequins to be visible from space, made quite the impression. Their dynamic was immediately clear. He was the exhausted protagonist of a never-ending action serial, and she was the relentless plot device. As Roderick began his frantic, gesticulating explanation of his intimacy issues, the humor of the situation manifested in his total inability to realize he was describing his own addiction to the thrill of the rescue. Sabada didn't bother to argue. She merely reclined on my office chair, polishing her nails with the unbothered air of a woman who knew exactly how much chaos she could trigger by simply existing. Just as I prepared to launch into a speech about healthy boundaries, the floor decided to save me the trouble of being a competent therapist. The room erupted. Green, hellfire-tinged flames tore the floorboards asunder, revealing a classic, skull-headed lich in a dramatic, gold-threaded cloak. He did the whole routine. The booming, theatrical announcement of doom, the kidnapping of a conveniently fainting Sabada, and the theatrical descent into the abyss. Roderick's reaction was the true punchline. After the portal sealed, leaving us with nothing but singed carpet and a very confused potted plant, he didn't look shattered by the loss of his wife. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd left the stove on. A mixture of deep, existential dread and an undeniable, pathetic eagerness to go save her again. I didn't even try to stop him as he charged out. I simply reached into my bottom drawer, pulled out a jar of enchanted dust motes, and gave the container a firm shake. The tiny, glowing creatures swarmed the charred crater, stitching the floor back together with efficient, magical indifference. Andressa met me in the waiting room, already marking my schedule with a sharp, pointed quill. One look at her expression, a blend of "I hope the office burns down next time" and "I'm hungry," was all the communication we needed. We didn't discuss the lich, the kidnapping, or the catastrophic failure of the session. We just headed for the door, bound for the new Goblin Kebab shop. If I couldn't provide stability for my patients, I could at least provide a very stressful, high-maintenance lunch for the waitstaff. The walk to the new Goblin Kebab joint was short, though we had to dodge a stampede of aggressive street vendors and a rogue levitation spell that was currently terrorizing a fruit stand. The establishment, a cramped hole in the wall with smoke pouring from its chimney in rhythmic puffs, was already packed. Andressa was in her element. Her skin flushed a deeper, more vibrant crimson as she approached the counter, and I could practically taste the spike in ambient panic coming off the poor goblin server. She didn't just order, she performed. She requested a skewering sequence so mathematically improbable and temperature-specific that I watched the server's eyes glaze over in genuine, unadulterated distress. She wanted the meat seared at the exact moment of a minor solar flare, or perhaps she just enjoyed watching the poor creature scramble to maintain his professional composure. I stood to the side, pretending to study the menu, though it was mostly a collection of unidentifiable charred bits, and sipped on my water. It was a strange spectacle, watching my secretary dismantle a stranger's confidence with nothing more than a list of dietary restrictions and a predatory smile. When the server finally scurried off to the kitchen, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 30 seconds, Andressa turned to me with a satisfied, sharp-toothed grin. "I trust this meets your exacting standards?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock sincerity. I paid the bill, feeling a vague sense of complicity, but the food, when it finally arrived, charred, spicy, and perfectly cooked, was worth the moral tax. Back at the office, the repair mode had done its job. The floor was sealed, the green scorch marks faded, and the air lacked the lingering scent of brimstone. It was clean, efficient, and hauntingly normal. I sat at my desk and looked at the stack of paperwork that Andressa had already sorted, filed, and color-coded. She had turned my chaotic, miserable existence into a streamlined engine of professional service. I picked up Imprisoned by the Drake Prince, the book she had practically insisted on, and leaned back in my chair. There were worse ways to spend an afternoon, I supposed. The office was quiet, the rift to the Lich's realm was closed, and for the first time in weeks, no one was actively screaming or trying to kidnap anyone. It was a dangerous kind of peace, but I was beginning to think I might have. The meeting room was a riot of discordant noise and forced proximity. I had invited a small army of locals, dwarves, naga, dryads, and more, to mingle with my support group, hoping that real-world exposure might break through the insular walls the Earth arrivals kept building. The air was thick with the scent of ale and the strained, awkward energy of 30 strangers trying not to stare at each other's various limbs, tails, and tusks. I spent the first hour acting as a glorified human traffic controller. After a few rounds of not-so-subtle threats involving icebreaker games, I managed to get Sarah, who generally considered anything non-human a personal affront, into a conversation with TYK, a lizard folk bard. She was actually holding her own, trading sharp quips that seemed to earn a genuine, tongue-flicking chuckle from the lizard. In the center of the room, however, the diplomatic process took a violent turn. Eric, ever the stubborn defender of his own brand of American engineering, had decided to debate the structural integrity of a dwarven hammer with its owner. The argument escalated with impressive speed from a loud, condescending lecture into a full-scale brawl. They rolled across the floor in a tangle of limbs and profanity, trading blows with such enthusiasm that I hesitated to intervene. When they finally broke apart, panting and bloodied, the tension snapped, replaced by a roar of laughter and a sudden, mutual respect forged in the crucible of a good, honest punch to the face. They were best friends by the time they hit the refreshment table. I drifted toward the corner to find Ben. He was stewing in a puddle of his own resentment, complaining that his lack of romantic success was entirely due to his looks. I pushed past the ego-defensive maneuvers and tried to lay the truth out flat. His personality was the lead anchor, sinking his ship, not his appearance. I even tried the book gambit, tossing him a copy of Leather Wings and Lavender Lips to illustrate that taste in Avalon was infinitely broader than he cared to admit. He didn't take it well. He shoved the book back at me, spewed a few choice profanities, and stormed out, knocking aside a group of startled dryads on his way to the exit. I watched him go, then glanced back at the room. Eric was clinking glasses with his new dwarven brother, and Sarah was still engaged with a lizard folk bard. The room was noisy, messy, and arguably failing at being a support group, but the connections were real. I grabbed a fresh drink, leaned against the table, and decided that one runaway ego wasn't a total loss when everything else was finally starting to breathe. The office day began with a blatant violation of culinary decency. I watched Andressa fold a donut, obliterating the structural integrity of the pastry with her fangs, and felt a profound sense of cultural loss. It was, however, the least of my problems. Li Jinhai, the 300-year-old young master of the heavenly tyrant sword sect, made his entrance with the subtlety of a house fire. His entourage carpeted my waiting room in flower petals, and he utilized a human servant as a literal footstool, which was both a logistical nightmare for my office furniture and an immediate red flag. He was a creature of high-octane vanity, draped in silk that practically weaponized light, and possessed a sneer that looked like it had been surgically grafted to his face. The session was an exercise in ego management. He was here strictly because his father, A man he clearly worshipped with a mix of awe and unearned entitlement had ordered it. He spent the first 10 minutes informing me that my advice was a millennium out of date, while his footstool servant beamed with the kind of bizarre, sycophantic joy that usually requires a decade of brainwashing to achieve. He told me of a conflict involving an old man he'd attempted to bully and the worm who had dared to stand in his way. He wasn't looking for growth. He was looking for a tactical guide on how to ruin this man's life without his father noticing. I steered the conversation toward consequences. I poked at the fragility of his hierarchy and the potential for a catastrophic fallout that would involve his sect burning to the ground. It was the psychological equivalent of throwing a rock at a hornet's nest. When the pressure got too high, he finally snapped, surging to his feet with enough killing intent to make the office's dampening runes hum in protest. He stormed out, but when he insulted Andressa on his way past, the professional line finally snapped. I stood my ground, threatening to bar him from the premises and report his lack of progress to his father. He loomed, radiating power that made the air grow thin, but he knew the risk. He backed down, letting a servant issue an apology on his behalf before he disappeared in a cloud of ego and floral debris. I collapsed onto the floor the second the door shut, clutching my chest. My heart was doing a frantic, arrhythmic dance against my ribs. "Oh, but you were so very dashing," Andressa teased, poking her head out from behind the desk. I ignored her, focusing entirely on the slow, deliberate breathing exercises I usually reserve for the truly unhinged. I'd survived a god of Sunday brunch and a literal embodiment of existential dread, but the sheer, blinding audacity of a 300-year-old toddler with a sword was almost the end of me. "I'm going to need a bigger coffee pot," I muttered, still staring at the ceiling. "And a vacuum for these damn pets." The gnome's delight was a masterclass in spatial inequality. Built for a species that averaged 3 feet, it forced the rest of us to navigate like spelunkers in a suit, all while charging a premium for the privilege of a human-sized glass. I sat in a dim corner, nursing a drink that tasted like a pine forest had caught fire, waiting for Sarah to take the stage. The open Isbith night was, predictably, a train wreck of poor time management. A dwarven throat singer set the tone, followed by a necromancer whose ventriloquism act was hindered by the fact that the dummy kept trying to crawl away. But the real showstopper was Fabinaccio. The bard had fully leaned into his new depressed goth phase. With hair dyed coal black, thick eyeliner, and a moody, dirge-like arrangement of his lute, he launched into a parody of a mournful ballad about the sheer exhaustion of being desired by everyone. It was absurd, dramatic, and exactly the kind of artistic pivot that makes therapists weep silently into their drinks. Andressa slid into the seat beside me, looking like a dark, elegant storm in a green silk dress. She didn't ask before sampling my drink, leaving a faint, dark smudge of lipstick on the rim. She was there to feast on the room's ambient anxiety, the jagged, fluttering nerves of amateur performers, and the thick, suffocating layer of secondhand embarrassment radiating from the crowd. I couldn't help but notice how her presence shifted my internal landscape. The phantom itch of memories involving Katrina, the beach, the distance, the unresolved endings, was dampened, buried under the immediate, sharp-edged reality of Andressa's glowing eyes and predatory humor. Then, Sarah took the stage. She bypassed her usual routine of regurgitating tired jokes from home and leaned into the absurdity of our shared existence. She talked about the tedious, multi-hour narratives of elven acquaintances and the deeply unsettling logistics of eating as a Dullahan. The room loved it. She was finding her footing, mining the bizarre reality of Avalon for genuine, punchy humor. But I watched the support group regulars in the back. They weren't laughing. They were wearing polite, brittle masks. They wanted the familiar, the comfort of Earth, the echo of things they had left behind. After the set, I found her at the bar, nursing a drink and looking deflated despite her success. "They were disappointed," she murmured, eyeing the group in the corner. "They wanted a security blanket," I said, sliding onto the stool next to her. "You gave them a mirror." "Is that my job?" she asked, voice small. "To keep them comfortable?" "Your job is to be you," I replied. I'm the one tasked with keeping them from shattering. If you want to keep flexing those new muscles, do it. I'll handle the fallout. We toasted to that, a fragile, necessary bridge between the people they were and the people they were becoming. I glanced back toward the corner where Andressa sat, watching us with a sharp, calculating interest. The night was loud, the drinks were expensive, and the emotional labor was, as usual, completely off the books. But for once, nobody had been kidnapped, and nobody had tried to overthrow a sect. I'd call that a win. The dreams were not dreams. They were architectural blueprints for madness. I woke with the iron tang of blood on my lips and a head full of star-devouring voids, a sure sign that my subconscious had decided to take a holiday in the forbidden reaches of the multiverse. After a hurried, frantic morning ritual involving a healing scroll just to quiet the screaming in my own psyche, I headed out. The morning light felt fragile. Hilda was working the counter at the bakery, her arms a tapestry of kitchen scars, looking as exhausted as I felt. We traded the usual pleasantries, her gossip about Mia's disastrous DIY haircut providing a thin veneer of normalcy over the yawning, cosmic dread sitting in my gut. I took the pastries, special treats for Andressa, and dodged a Naga's tail on my way out, clutching the bags like they were anchors to reality. At the office, Andressa was already there. She'd handled the mysterious appointment request by drinking the very memory of it, a move I found equal parts professional and terrifying. She spent the morning oscillating between cryptic observations about my anxiety levels and the kind of sharp-edged banter that usually kept me on my toes. I was too drained to play along. I spent the hours between appointments casting mental fortification spells and hoarding every scrap of sanity I could find. Then, the last appointment arrived. I didn't hear a knock. I simply ceased to be in my office. I was suspended in a soundless, color-drenched void before being unceremoniously dropped back into my chair. The entity on my couch was a sensory catastrophe. It was a shifting, non-Euclidean blur that turned the air to static and forced me to expend every ounce of my magical shielding just to remain conscious. The conversation was equally taxing. An ancient, reality-warping horror was struggling with the incompetence of its own fan club. The cultists had interpreted a simple, celestial color-coding request by turning a temple into a slaughterhouse, much to the deity's aesthetic disappointment. My office floor was currently being coated in a viscous, unidentifiable ichor as the entity lamented the lack of nuanced communication in the mortal realm. I suggested a herald, some middle management demigod, to act as a buffer between the cosmic and the mundane, and the entity, in a burst of blinding brilliance that nearly incinerated my last scroll, seemed to agree. The moment the entity vanished, the silence in the office was deafening. I sat at my desk, looking down at my hands, which were slick with a mixture of my own blood and celestial residue. I felt like I'd been hollowed out and refilled with gravel. The tea was cold, the office was a biological hazard, and the only thing I wanted was to scrub my skin until it felt like it belonged to a human again. I slumped back, staring at the ceiling. The job of a therapist in Avalon was supposed to be about emotions and relationships, but sometimes it was just about surviving a consultation with the end of the universe without losing your mind entirely. Tomorrow was another day, provided I could stop the weeping from my eyes long enough to read the schedule. The delivery of 100 Beauty and the Beast variations was not, despite Andressa's wide-eyed, angelic suggestions, an act of personal vanity. It was a tactical necessity for a client who treated his own life like a stubborn, self-destructive narrative. Andressa, however, refused to be a mere administrative observer. Between the deliberate brushing of her tail against my skin and her playful, pointed comments, the atmosphere in the office had become thick enough to slice with a letter opener. She was turning office banter into a contact sport, and I was losing my edge. The arrival of Avalon, a high-strung, aerodynamic elf artificer, provided a brief reprieve. He floated into the office as if gravity were merely a suggestion he had chosen to ignore, though his eyes were frantic. The session was a psychological wreck. He was hopelessly, agonizingly infatuated with a dwarven smith. The disconnect was stark. He worshipped the very things he was conditioned to find repulsive. He spoke of soot-stained hands and muscular, anvil-forged shoulders with a fervor that bordered on religious, his usual elven composure shattering under the weight of his own repressed desires. He was vibrating with a physical need that was entirely incompatible with his carefully curated sense of aesthetic superiority. I steered him away from a workplace confession, which would likely result in an awkward HR disaster, and toward a practical, clinical experiment. I suggested the red glow district. It was, I reasoned, the most efficient way to discern whether he was wrestling with a genuine emotional connection or a fetishistic obsession with a taboo contrast. The elf didn't even wait to discuss the therapeutic implications. He bolted, discarding his usual grace in favor of a frantic, athletic sprint toward the exit. He hadn't even finished his tea. When I stepped out, Andressa was waiting. She had already claimed one of the books from the crate, a look of predatory amusement fixed on her face. She was offering a trade, an hour of reading aloud or a bribe of sugar. The air was charged, and the office, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, felt suddenly very small. I found myself looking at her, really looking at her, and the thought of buying a sweet drink felt less like a bribe and more like a surrender I wasn't entirely opposed to be making. The support group meeting was quieter than the previous chaotic session, and I found the shift in tempo welcome. The room was bathed in the dim, steady light of enchanted sconces, and the usual suspects were present, each occupying their own orbit of recovery. I watched the circle, Sarah, no longer performing, just talking, Eric, grumbling but noticeably softer, and Ben, lurking on the periphery like a man afraid of his own shadow. My own internal landscape had been settling as well. The sharp, jagged edges of my memories of Katrina, the specific, painful details of her presence, were beginning to dull. I spent less time actively mourning the past and more time managing the present. I realized, perhaps a bit belatedly, that I had been using the office as a fortress, hiding behind the problems of others to avoid the slow, tedious work of building my own life from the scraps of the old one. The flow of the meeting was disrupted by the arrival of Christoph. He was an adventurer, successful by any metric, and possessed the kind of effortless, golden-haired confidence that made others instinctively dislike him. Yet, he carried a heavy, invisible fatigue, while the newer members, like Hannah, questioned why such a seemingly adjusted individual needed us. I saw the truth. Integration is a performance, and performing is exhausting. When it was my turn to speak, I broke the standard protocol. I spoke of Magpie, the cat I'd left behind, and the simple, jarring realization that my grief was keeping me anchored to a home that no longer existed. It was a small admission, but it served its purpose. It let the group see that the person steering the ship was just as lost at sea as they were. Christoph eventually opened up. The barrier he described was the fundamental ailment of our existence here. The crushing loneliness of being the only person who understands a cultural reference, or the suffocating awkwardness of failing to grasp the social nuances of a world that didn't share your history. He wasn't failing to adapt. He was just mourning the loss of a common language. I reminded them that the wall was meant to be climbed, not bypassed, and that our failures to reach the other side were a shared, collective struggle. As the meeting wound down, the dynamic shifted. People gathered around Christoph, their skepticism replaced by the camaraderie of shared isolation. Even Ben, usually a bastion of resistance, found himself caught in the gravitational pull of the group. I decided to make my move. I dragged the wagon, a ridiculous, heavy-duty mobile library of supernatural romance, across the floor and dumped it at Ben's feet. He looked at the mountain of salacious, lurid covers with a mixture of horror and begrudging resignation. "You're not letting this go, are you?" he muttered. "Not anymore," I said. "You're hiding behind your appearance because it's easier than admitting your personality is doing the heavy lifting." He tried to deflect, but he was tired. I could see in the way he slumped. He was running out of excuses, and he knew it. When he finally asked for a path forward, I didn't offer a miracle. I offered the one thing he had consistently avoided, consistent one-on-one accountability. He didn't agree to read the books, but he didn't walk away either. It was a fragile, tiny victory, but in a world of gods and eldritch horrors, it felt solid enough to hold on to. The balcony was the final frontier for Nas Treebeard. I watched him stand at the threshold, knuckles white against the railing, his breath a ragged, rhythmic labor against the encroaching panic. He didn't flee. He didn't collapse. He simply endured, and in that endurance, I saw the steady, quiet architecture of recovery. When he finally stepped back inside, the transformation was evident, not just in his posture, but in the way he described his work at the warehouse, no longer defined by his uncle's pity, but by his own burgeoning competence. Fabinaccio followed, a dark, gothic fever dream of mascara and gloom. He was entirely convinced his stylistic pivot was the result of my genius, blissfully unaware that I was trying to steer him toward emotional transparency, not a career in tragic cabaret. He bounded out the door with a dramatic flourish, leaving me to prepare for the arrival of Zack, Carol, and Princess Gralia. The session was a claustrophobic dance of resentment and redirected desire. They were caught in a rigid, hierarchical deadlock. Gralia demanded a subservient concubine, while Carol demanded the status of a wife. Zack sat between them, a man drowning in the very surplus of love he had spent years collecting. It was only when Andressa slipped a magically highlighted tome of Lindarian marriage law onto my desk, a book the Infinite Library had seemingly curated specifically for this disaster, that the stalemate broke. The law allowed for multiple equal spouses, a technicality that reframed the entire conflict. They didn't resolve the marriage, but they resolved the hierarchy. As I watched them leave, Andressa leaned back at her desk, her presence a low-frequency hum of predatory amusement. She noted the thick, suffocating layer of sexual tension in the room, not between the man and his partners, but the magnetic, fractious charge between the two women themselves. It was an observation that shifted the entire puzzle into place. The final appointment of the day was the most surreal. Princess Sabah and Prince Roderick arrived with a terrifying, unified serenity. Sabah insisted that their previous issues were settled, a dismissal that Roderick met with a knowing, dangerous glint in his eye. I didn't have time to process the warning. A cacophony of shattered glass and displaced air tore through the office as a rainbow-winged harpy queen descended, snatching Roderick in a display of calculated, swooping violence. He didn't struggle. He swooned with the practiced ease of a man who had finally found someone to play the game in reverse. I stood in the wreckage of the balcony, dusting debris from my suit, and looked at a bewildered, shattered Sabah. It was a reminder that in Avalon, the roles we assign to others, damsel, hero, captor, are often just costumes, and everyone eventually decides to try a different fit. The Department of Magical Verifications was a masterclass in bureaucratic torment. Its architecture, a shifting, non-Euclidean nightmare of blue-gray stone and gravity-defying stairways, felt specifically designed to erode the sanity of anyone seeking to comply with the law. Waiting in line behind a golem and a gnome was a stroke of luck. The gnome finished his business and departed by hopping off a staircase that led into thin air, a departure that lacked both grace and a destination. I reached the counter, deposited my documents, and watched as the entity behind the desk, a shifting collection of eyes and mouths, methodically processed my business license renewal. It licked each corner of the paperwork with a variety of tongues that sprouted from its own eye sockets, a process that was as efficient as it was deeply disturbing. It was finished in minutes, leaving me with the rare, disorienting gift of a free afternoon. The transition to the atrium was interrupted by the sight of Andressa. She looked uncharacteristically harried, her tail twitching with feline irritation and her posture lacking its usual predatory poise. She was there to shed her status as an arrival from hell to officially become a local of Avalon. I offered to guide her, and she accepted with the resigned air of a demon who had just realized she was going to have to deal with a human's expert advice. The stairs were a sensory hazard. Midway up, a perspective shift sent a jolt of vertigo through us both. She reached out, gripping my shoulder to steady herself. You're shaking, I noted, trying to lighten the mood. It's not the stairs, she hissed, her tail still lashing. It's the sheer audacity of this government. I've survived the pits of the Ninth Circle, but this form has a box that asks for my maternal origin and my current allegiance in the same breath. It's like they want to start an interdimensional war. It's just paperwork, Andressa. If you fill it out wrong, you just get a fine. Or maybe a minor curse. Usually it wears off by Tuesday. She stared at me, her eyes flashing gold. A minor curse. You say that like it's a paper cut. In Avalon, it basically is, I said. We waited in line behind a fae who was currently trying to pay his taxes in riddles and a creature that appeared to be composed entirely of damp sponges. As we stood there, the mask of the unflappable secretary slipped. She admitted to a genuine fear of the paperwork, a surprising vulnerability that grounded her. I shared my own early, terrifying experiences in Avalon. The isolation, the terror of the mundane, and the time I spent a week trying to order a sandwich from a sentient bush because I was too intimidated to talk to a person. A sandwich? She asked, a smirk breaking through her frustration. Did you at least tip it? I gave it a leaf. I thought it was polite. We reached the final counter. When the clerk noted a missing initial, her composure nearly fractured, the color draining from her skin. She recovered with a stolen pen and a steady hand, scribbling on the form with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. The approval was granted with alarming efficiency, skipping the usual marathon of secondary counters. You got lucky, I said as we stepped away. Usually you have to sacrifice a goat to the DMV director to skip the third counter. I'll keep that in mind for next time, she replied. We navigated the return journey through the shifting atrium. When we reached the exit, I considered asking her to stay, to bridge the distance between the office and the rest of our lives, but the impulse died in my throat. I was still anchored to the caution that had defined me since my arrival. Well, I said, offering a weak smile. I'll see you tomorrow. She looked at me, a flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, crossing her face before the cool, professional mask slid back into place. Try not to get cursed on the way home, John. It would be such a waste of a good suit. I walked away, heading back to my apartment for a long afternoon of staring at a wall. She watched me go, and I had the sinking suspicion that if I had turned around, she would have been rolling her eyes at the sheer, agonizing slowness of the process. The office was less of a sanctuary and more of a damp tomb tonight. Outside, the sky was throwing a tantrum, the thunder rattling my teeth and making the coffee in my mug vibrate with an intensity usually reserved for tectonic shifts. I sat there, trying to look professional, while my brain slowly turned into lukewarm porridge. Then, a voice dripped from the ceiling like a particularly suave leak. Good evening. I looked up. Radu was clinging to the crown molding like a discarded piece of damp laundry, his black cloak defying both gravity and basic physics. Radu, I said, suppressing the urge to ask him to please use a chair. I see you've mastered the art of the dramatic arrival. How are you? He dropped, spinning in the air with the flair of a man who owned far too many silk vests, and landed on the couch in a pose that was frankly exhausting to look at. Bored, John. Stiflingly, agonizingly bored. I'd have taken up bird-watching if the pigeons didn't have such a judgmental glint in their eyes. Well, you're not my first vampire client, I noted, opening my notebook. Oh, he leaned forward, eyes widening. Do tell. Is it Count Valerius? I bet it's Valerius. He's the only one with enough ego to seek therapy. I can't say. Fine, keep your secrets. I'll just go and bite everyone I see until I find him. It'll be a grand scavenger hunt. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. Let's stick to the ennui. Walk me through a night. Or unlife. Whatever. Easy, he said, waving a hand. I wake up at twilight, untangle myself from a pile of weeping brides, standard procedure, really, and go hunt. Yesterday, I had a dwarf. Terribly chewy. Had to floss for hours. Then, it's off to a masquerade. There's always a coup, usually over a stolen monocle or a slight regarding someone's great-grandfather, and then I go home for some light debauchery. It's rinse and repeat, really. I stared at him. Radu, Do you realize you're just living the same day, every day, for 600 years? You're essentially the protagonist of a very tedious, blood-soaked sitcom. He blinked. I failed to see the insult. Have you considered, I don't know, not trying to seduce every mortal you meet? Maybe take up woodworking? Or try to beat a high score in a video game? Like a commoner? He sneered. I'm a creature of the night, John. My hobbies involve conquest, shadows, and the occasional dramatic flair. I've met immortal ghosts who knit sweaters, Radu. They're much happier than you. You're not a tragic figure. You're just a guy who refuses to learn how to bake sourdough. He looked genuinely offended. I do not bake. Maybe you should. It takes patience. It takes precision. And it's hard to plot a coup when you're worried about your starter culture. He tapped a fong thoughtfully. A coup involving yeast? That is Byzantine. We're making progress. Now, how about emotional connections? Aside from the debauchery and the betrayal, do you actually have a friend? Someone you don't want to stab or seduce? I don't see the difference. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if the lightning might do me the favor of ending the session early. Right. Well, I'm not dating you, and I'm definitely not letting you bite me to make your night nicer. Your time is up. Such a shame, he said, standing up. You have such a deliciously stressed-out pulse. Krakatoa. He was gone. I sat there in the silence, listening to the rain. My routine. Same suit, same desk, same neurotic clients. I was basically a vampire, just with lower iron levels and a much worse tailor. I groaned and reached for the coffee, hoping the next client didn't have a cape. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sensation of a hand drumming on my chest, which was exactly the kind of surreal sensory input that usually meant I'd fallen asleep in my office again. Andressa was standing over me, looking less like a secretary and more like a patient supervisor who had finally run out of patience. Did the Fae find some way to weasel you out of your apartment? She asked. I sat up, blankets sliding off me, and offered a weak, sleep-crusted smile. I just meant to close my eyes for a second. You have a client in 2 hours, she said, before retreating to her desk. I spent the next 20 minutes using a magical scroll to undo the damage of an overnight sleep in a suit, a luxury that saved me from looking like a crumpled piece of parchment and settled into a lukewarm, honey-flavored bagel she'd thoughtfully left for me. I was starting to feel human again when Andressa ushered in Magni. Magni was a warrior, built like a fortress and radiating the kind of battle-hardened competence that usually suggested a very specific, practical set of problems. Unfortunately, none of those problems were the issue. Hanging around her neck was an amulet of solid gold, shaped like a shrieking skull with green flames flickering in its eye sockets. It whispered, not metaphorically. It was actively broadcasting a low, malevolent murmur that made my skin crawl. Magni the Misfortunate, she said, shaking my hand with a grip that could crush stone. I can see why, I said, eyeing the cursed jewelry. Let's talk. She sat down, radiating a cloud of genuine catastrophe. She told me the story. A retirement plan wiped out by a sunken ship, a fortune stolen from an unbreakable vault, a house claimed by a sinkhole, and a cheating boyfriend, all happening in a rapid-fire sequence of divine-level bad luck. I feel like there must be something wrong with me, she concluded. I leaned forward, trying to keep the horror off my face. I don't think it's you. I think it's the skull-shaped, fire-eyed, whispering death charm you're wearing. She clutched it defensively. It's just jewelry. I explained this to the mage in my party when I found it. Then humor me, I said, my voice as level as I could manage. Take it off, just for a second. Place it on the couch. She paled. Her hand hovered over the gold, trembling, before she pulled back. I don't want to. It goes with my outfit. That was the nail in the coffin. I stood up, excused myself, and stepped into the waiting room. 2 guards were already there, looking like they were expecting the worst. Is it in there? One mouthed. I nodded, whispering, yes, please, try not to break anything. They hit the door like a battering ram, but they were a second too late. The office balcony window was open, the curtain fluttering in the wind, and Magni was already gone. Damn it, I muttered. Andressa stood by her desk, looking at a device that was vibrating with enough intensity to rattle the stationery. The curse sensor was screaming, John. She's probably halfway across the city by now. The guard walked back out, looking more tired than angry. They'd done this too many times. We'll track it, one said, adjusting his belt. An object that powerful leaves a magical trail a mile wide. Curse screenings are free, the other added, shaking his head. Why do they keep walking into the city wearing death traps? At least it wasn't a sword this time. Those usually involve more paperwork. I walked back into my office and stared at the empty chair. I had a bagel, a lukewarm coffee, and an open window where disaster had just escaped. I really needed a vacation. The guard station was a sensory assault, a chaotic ecosystem of arrested necromancers, disgruntled vampires in burlap, and mage guards who seemed one mispronounced syllable away from turning the floor into lava. I navigated the sea of chaos, dodging a leprechaun who had clearly had a bad day, until I found Dirk, who looked relieved to see me. Dirk, the brain guy is here, the front desk centaur bellowed, his voice vibrating my internal organs. Dirk quickly ushered me toward the quieter, dimly lit back hallways. Usually we don't see this kind of rush until Hollytide, he muttered, sounding like a man who spent his life waiting for a quiet day that never came. He led me to a cell where a young man was sitting cross-legged, staring intensely at a blank wall. This was Jake. He was thin, bedraggled, and currently convinced he was a savior of all greatest dragon warrior of power. He treated his status, a list of stats he recited with the precision of a man reading a technical manual, as gospel. He even had a rock that he claimed was an awakening stone, which, as Dirk had already whispered, was just a rock. I'm close to a level up, Jake said, pumping his fist at thin air. Ding. I didn't need a medical degree to diagnose this. It was blue screen syndrome, the psyche's desperate, automated attempt to convert a terrifying, nonsensical new reality into the familiar, predictable interface of a game. By turning the world into numbers, he felt in control. By grinding for levels, he felt like he had agency. It was a common, stubborn, and frequently fatal coping mechanism. I need to leave, Jake told me, eyes bloodshot. My progress is stalling in here. How about you try meditating on the softness of the cot? I suggested. Focus on how relaxing your muscles before a strike makes you hit harder. He fell for it instantly, snoring within seconds of hitting the mattress. Dirk looked on, bewildered. That was impressive. I've been trying to get him to sleep all day. He's not actually meditating, I said, rubbing my temples. He's just exhausted from his own brain, trying to process his life as a spreadsheet. I outlined the plan to Dirk. We couldn't just shatter the delusion. It was currently the only thing holding the guy's sanity together. We had to feed it. We'd give him mana water, a bath, essence stones, meatballs, and a wooden post to hit until he was tired enough to sleep through the night. You can fix him then? Dirk asked. Eventually, I said, though I felt the familiar weight of the task. But first, I have to stop him from trying to level up his durability by fighting giants. Dirk winced. I take it he's tried that. More than once. The saddest part is that when they lose, they just think they've failed the encounter and need to grind more. I walked back out through the chaos of the guard station, the smell of ozone and damp dungeon air clinging to my suit. I had a long-term plan for Jake, but as I stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't help but wonder if my own professional detachment was just a different kind of system, a way of labeling, quantifying, and processing the madness of Avalon, so I didn't have to admit that I was just as lost as the people I was treating. The morning started with a slow, rhythmic drip of water onto my forehead, a persistent leak in my apartment ceiling that had officially graduated from minor annoyance to hostile intent. I spent the first hour of my day doing what I always did, fighting the urge to crawl back under the covers and engaging in the quiet, desperate ritual of convincing myself that the world was still worth interacting with. My dreams had been a fractured, nonsensical collage of demonic tales and red-hued figures, remnants of a subconscious that seemed to be actively mocking my current state of stasis. In the shower, the cold water did its best to scrub away the existential dread, but the intrusive thoughts were resilient. I thought about Katrina, about the cat I'd left behind on Earth, and the crushing realization that my life had become a series of practiced, identical loops. I wasn't just in a rut. I was the architect of my own cage. I stood before my wardrobe, staring at the green suits that had become my uniform. I almost reached for the blue one, the one from Katrina, but the weight of the memory was too heavy. I couldn't afford that kind of vulnerability before lunch. I chose the familiar instead. I stepped out into the streets, dodging falling debris from a slow-moving giant snail that was currently clogging the main artery of the city, and found myself drifting toward a spontaneous market. The kobolds, gnomes, and fae had turned the street into a vibrant, chaotic bazaar that felt like a rebuke to my own stagnation. I bought a few trinkets, a dragon scale pendant, a bat skull necklace, and a ruby-red pen, little artifacts of a world that refused to stop moving even when I did. At Hilda's, I broke my sacred code of mediocrity. Could I actually get some of that honey cream cheese? I asked. Mia, looking as eclectic and sharp as ever, didn't even blink, though the small deviation felt monumental. I gave her the bat skull necklace. She tied it on with the casual ease of a woman who wore death symbols as accessories. Skulls always go with everything, she said. Back at the office, I found Andressa in the middle of some paperwork. I had apparently left my shirt in a state of disarray, for buttons undone, which earned me a sharp, mocking look that sent a familiar jolt of heat through the room. If you're going to wear your shirt like that, we may need to start charging our clients double, she said. I buttoned it quickly, feeling the familiar, infuriating crimson rise in her cheeks. I handed her the ruby pen. She accepted it with a dexterity that made my fingers feel clumsy, clicking it with a satisfied, rhythmic snap. Do you buy all of your gifts for people based on their skin color? She asked, her tone dripping with amused skepticism. Just people who work for me. I retorted, though the sarcasm fell flat. It's nice that you thought of me, she said, her voice softening just enough to make the air feel thin. And I like the color. Me too, I replied, the words hanging in the air with a weight I hadn't intended. The tension was sharp enough to cut, but I retreated into the safety of the schedule. Renee, Ben, and the usual parade of neurotic souls awaited. As I poured coffee for Andressa, watching her use the new pen, the dread that had been sitting in my chest since I woke up began to recede. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a grand, universe-spanning adventure, or a life on an infinite beach. But as I sat at my desk and spread honey-flavored cream cheese onto a fresh bagel, it felt like a start. I was still in my office, and I was still wearing a green suit, but for the first time in a long time, the day didn't feel like a closed loop. It felt like something else entirely. Rene arrived with his customary grace, a small hat clutched in his hand, and a smile that seemed to brighten the dim waiting room. I welcomed him in, the tea prep becoming a muscle memory reflex. A strong, dark blend, 2 sugar cubes, and a spoonful of honey. The ritual was a steadying anchor for us both. I handed him the dragon scale pendant I'd picked up earlier. He looked genuinely touched, brushing aside the minor hiccup of his translation enchantment failing for a moment. A fine gift, he said, and for a second, the heavy, lingering melancholy he often carried seemed to lift. But as we settled into the session, the cracks in that composure appeared. The subject was Esme, the dwarven mechanic who had captured his interest. She had asked him to move in, and while he spoke of her with clear affection, the proposal had triggered a deeper, more paralyzing crisis. It feels like I'm giving up, Rene admitted, staring into his tea. That I'll never return to France, never rejoin my brothers. It was the classic exile's trap. I listened as he laid out the dissonance. He wasn't actively trying to leave Avalon, yet accepting a domestic life here felt like a final, irreversible betrayal of his past. I used the metaphor of the fig, a bit of literary trivia that felt fitting for a man of his sensibilities, to explain that every choice inherently requires the pruning of other possibilities. If you don't take this step, what happens? I asked. She will end our courtship, he replied softly. Then you're at a crossroads, Renee. You're stalling because you're trying to avoid the grief of closing a door you haven't even fully opened yet. I pushed him to consider transparency. He feared that asking for more time would violate the strict etiquette of his upbringing, but he finally conceded that Esme's kindness deserved the truth. He was still the pilot waiting to take flight, still the man, missing a world that might not want him back. But by the end of our hour, he seemed a little less haunted by the decision. Fantastic girls don't wait forever, Renee. I reminded him gently as he prepared to leave. They have their own doors to open. He left with a nod, his resolve a bit firmer. As I cleared away the tea service, I found myself fidgeting with a bright red napkin on my desk, my mind wandering to my own closed doors, to the life I'd left behind, to the quiet, static loops I'd built for myself here. I tossed the napkin into the trash, the sharp movement serving as a small, private exclamation point. I went to the coffee machine, the hum of the office filling the silence, and tried to focus on the next client. The day was moving, and for once, I was trying to keep pace. The day was a marathon of emotional weight, starting with a royal invitation, a soft, pink letter that signaled the high society consequences of Andressa's relentless efficiency. A royal wedding in Landaria was exactly the kind of complication I didn't know I needed, but watching Andressa claim her spot as my +1 with the casual authority of a queen seizing a throne settled the matter. She didn't even ask. She just annexed me. Lunch was a quick reprieve over troll soup. I spent the meal fervently hoping the chef wasn't using the human meat substitute option, but at this point in my life, I'm fairly certain my internal organs are 40% spite and 60% mystery stew. Then came the heavy lifting, Nost. Watching him stand at the threshold of a transport basket was like watching a kitten try to fight a blender. He didn't make the jump. He tripped over his own trauma, but he didn't break either. Andressa, who usually treats emotions like suspicious foreign contraband, was literally radiating heat, glowing like a magma lamp with sympathetic concern. Nost is healing one zigzag step at a time, and I'm just happy he didn't accidentally incinerate the waiting room. Valon the elf was next, having spent his nights in the Red Glow district trying to calculate his attraction to a dwarven co-worker via field research. It was the most awkward scientific breakdown of I have a crush I've ever heard. I told him to take the hard road and just confess. Honestly, the romantic incompetence in this office is enough to make me consider a career in sheep farming. But the day saved its strangest trial for last. I prepped for a headache, but instead, I got a literal incarnation of a Freudian slip nightmare. The herald of incomprehensible, an obsidian mass of discordant mouths, appeared in my office to vent about HR issues. Apparently, when you're a cosmic deity with a hive mind of trillions, being transparent just leads to your followers reverting to gratuitous blood sacrifice because they're bored. I told them I wanted an offering. The herald boomed, every mouth hitting a different note in a discordant, teeth-rattling chord. They immediately suggested a newborn. I just wanted a calf. It's so disappointing. We sat there discussing the merits of blowing up his entire workforce and starting over with dark, cryptic clues. It was the most high-stakes, terrifyingly stupid career counseling session of my life. I'm basically the cosmic version of a guy telling a serial-killing god to try networking on LinkedIn. Your morality is nearly incomprehensible to me, the herald rumbled. Back at ya, I said, mostly because I was too tired to try to explain the concept of not murdering people. When it vanished, the office was aggressively quiet. My head was pounding. The sun had long since set, and I was exhausted in a way that implies my soul has been run through a meat grinder. I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the echoes of a dwarf learning to breathe, an elf learning to talk, and a god learning to fire his entire fan club. I'm just a man in a polyester green suit, trying to keep everyone from accidentally triggering the apocalypse before my next coffee break. I really need a raise. The atrium of the Wizard's Tower looked less like a home and more like the frantic aftermath of a magical yard sale explosion. There was barely enough floor space to stand, and even the furniture seemed to be protesting the sheer volume of stuff piled onto it. I sat with a barbarian, a warrior, and a rogue, wondering if this was the first time an intervention had been held in a room where the upholstery was actively screaming. Nanak, the barbarian, had helpfully stuffed a pillow into the mouth of a complaining chair, which was honestly a more innovative use of furniture than I'd seen all week. She's going to turn me into a frog, Selena the rogue whispered, vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. I appreciate you being here, I said, trying to project the calm of a man who hadn't just spent the previous night dealing with a cosmic god who wanted to network his followers via blood sacrifice. I'm pretty great, she noted, instantly mollified. Then the cat arrived. Sir Crowfur, a black feline with the ego of a small deity, trotted in, dropped Yuman off, and immediately burrowed into a pile of junk like it was a bargain bin at a magical thrift store. Yuman appeared, classic wizard, all stars and moons, and looked around at her friends with the vague confusion of someone who didn't realize they were living in a landfill. I did my best to facilitate. Nana pulled out some fake glasses and read a script that was just a blank sheet of paper, which was the most barbarian thing I've ever seen. He complained about being stabbed 20 times by skeletons because Yuman wouldn't share a potion, which is fair. I've had cheaper therapists than her, but I've never had a client literally watch me get skewered by the undead to save a buck. Toll hit the nail on the head. It wasn't just the hoarding, it was the dangerous hoarding. The bracelet of eternal hangnails sounds like a prank gift from hell. Then came the cat. My food bowl is getting harder to reach, the familiar announced. Honestly, that was the most damning testimony of the day. A cat's inconvenience is the gold standard for a crisis. Yuman seemed to be taking it well. She stood up, thanked everyone, and admitted she had a problem. I felt the warm, fuzzy glow of a successful session. Then the purple light started. I think I'll turn you all into mice and let Crowfur hunt you until I feel better, Yuman stated, sounding as casual as someone deciding on a sandwich. Selena dove behind shelf. The air began to vibrate with that specific, headache-inducing hum of impending transfiguration. I didn't reach for my notebook. I reached for the door. It occurred to me that in my line of work, success is defined by leaving the room without turning into a rodent. Wait, Yuman shouted, pointing her glowing staff at me. I froze, smiling the most polite, non-mouse-like smile I could manage. If I need more help, could you help me? She asked. Of course, I said, already mentally calculating how much I should charge for wizard intervention recovery and non-rodent consultation fees. I stepped out into the hallway as the sound of tiny, frantic squeaking began to echo behind me. It wasn't the traditional resolution to an intervention, but in Avalon, you take the wins where you can get them. And honestly, as long as I wasn't the one being hunted by the cat, I was counting this day as a massive success. The morning started with an unnatural amount of optimism. I woke up feeling rested, clear-headed, and in a rare moment of self-awareness, fully ready to admit that I had a massive crush on my secretary. I even wore the green suit with the subtle square pattern, a choice I'd normally find too daring, but today I felt like a man about town. The city was clear, the birds were singing, and I was in such a good mood that I even found charm in the ugly, cute fluff chicks being pushed in a stroller. I was walking with a pep in my step, ready to banter with Andressa, fully prepared to embrace the romantic absurdity of my life. Then I walked into the wrong building. I realized it only after I sat down. The walls were slightly the wrong shade of eggshell, the rugs were reversed, and, the real kicker, my chair decided to give me a bear hug with its upholstery. I've sat in many chairs, but I've never sat in one that tried to digest me. A mimic, I shrieked, struggling as the desk sprouted teeth and the curtains tried to turn my neck into a drawstring bag. It turns out that a mimic isn't just a chest in a dungeon anymore. It's an entire office suite with a vendetta. I spent the next 10 minutes in a chaotic, undignified dance of survival, dodging a ramming couch, avoiding a bookshelf that was weaponizing my own knickknacks, and screaming for help with the unbridled panic of a man who just wanted a bagel. I was saved by a half-giant guard who burst in and treated my furniture like kindling. He scooped me up, not a heroic, cinematic carry, but more like he was hauling a sack of mildly frantic potatoes, and dumped me outside. That's when I noticed the real problem. There were two identical office buildings side by side. I had walked into the imposter office. The building I entered was currently being swarmed by guards as it tried to digest its own windows. Andressa came running over, looking genuinely panicked. She wrapped me in a hug that caught me off guard, but I leaned into it, mostly because my adrenaline was still busy trying to find an exit. When I saw there were 2 offices, I called the guard, she explained, her voice shaking just enough to make my chest ache. I tried to regain some scrap of professional dignity while smoothing down my suit. I'm alive. I don't know that I'd say I'm all right. I lost your pastries, I added, because clearly my priorities were in the right place, even while being hunted by a coffee table. She shot me a look that was equal parts concern and classic Andressa mockery. I think a real gentleman would go back in and get them. I moved toward the danger zone, mostly to call her bluff, but she caught my wrist with her tail, tight. On second thought, she said, pulling me back, you could just bring me double tomorrow. I looked at the building that was currently trying to eat its own front door, then back at her. I suppose that's one way to start a romance. Shared trauma and the promise of extra pastries. I might have been mauled by a mahogany desk, but at least I finally know where I stand. I just hope tomorrow the office stays inanimate. The day off was supposed to be a relaxing retreat, but without the structure of the office or the steady stream of humanish problems to solve, I felt like a clock with no gears. I spent the morning doing things that felt productive in theory. Grocery shopping from a sentient apple tree that took payment in nightmares. I'm still not sure if 2 copper was a bargain or a curse. And performing a sweaty, vaguely embarrassing workout with a weighted staff. I was mid-towel dry, feeling reasonably accomplished, when a knock at the door threw the whole day into a different orbit. It was Andressa. She looked like she'd stepped off a postcard for a demon's vacation. Black halter top, sunglasses, horns, and enough golden jewelry to make a dragon jealous. My brain, usually sharp enough to handle cosmic deities and malfunctioning furniture, immediately went into system failure mode. Have you forgotten what I look like without a desk in front of me? She teased, effectively dismantling my remaining 2 brain cells. She didn't just walk into the apartment. She invaded it, touring my bedroom. The hammock clearly offended her sensibilities and critiquing my lack of a dining table. But then, the sabotage shifted to something unexpectedly sweet. She brought smoked cave-boar ribs, my favorite. We ate on the coffee table, a feast of sauce and bone-crunching. Watching her eat, demons have a very literal approach to boneless ribs, was strangely mesmerizing. She didn't bother with etiquette, and honestly, the sheer efficiency of her jaw was intimidating. She cleaned her hands and face by igniting the sauce, which is a life hack I am deeply jealous of. Do you have any other plans for the day? I asked, my heart doing something frantic in my chest as the sun began to set. No, she sighed, sinking into my couch with a languid grace that made the apartment feel very small. We opened the wine, a dry white that she insisted on over red, a small rebellion against her own aesthetic, and proceeded to drink until the day dissolved into the night. It was the first time in years I'd felt truly unburdened. We talked until the wine turned us quiet, and when I finally looked over, she was asleep on the couch, the moonlight catching the gold of her jewelry. I draped a blanket over her, my hand grazing her arm. The jolt was electric, a sudden, sharp reminder that my feelings weren't just a crush anymore. I walked to my room, feeling the weight of the day and the terrifying potential of tomorrow. I didn't notice her eyes open in the dark as I left. I just closed my door, leaned against it, and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't really looking forward to the office. I was looking forward to breakfast. The office hummed with its usual brand of chaotic, multiversal bureaucracy. I started the day nursing a hangover, grateful that Andressa's midnight exit left me with nothing but a folded blanket and a note. Dealing with the mimic office incident had clearly soured the mood of the neighborhood. Hilda's was giving out free bagels as a sorry you almost got digested gesture. I'm starting to think my life is just a series of near misses with various types of consumer-grade furniture. My first client, Balthazar, arrived with Artorian, a 5-year-old sorcerer in training whose brain functioned like a hummingbird on a caffeine bender. I had a wasp once. Do you have any swords? Watching the ancient wizard try to wrangle a child with severe, untreated ADHD was like watching someone try to conduct a symphony with a blender. I explained the concept of ADHD to Balthazar, who seemed genuinely disappointed it wasn't a curse he could just dispel with a wave of his staff. I prescribed the only thing that works for a kid like that. A change in routine, some gamification, and, most importantly, finding a younger, faster guardian to help tire the boy out. At 47, Balthazar was fighting a losing war against a toddler's kinetic energy. But then, the afternoon took a turn for the surreal. Hargreave Bloodreaper walked in. The gladiator was literally built like a brick shithouse. He towered over the room, covered in tattoos that probably told better stories than I'll ever experience, and proceeded to flirt with Andressa with the subtlety of a siege engine. "My boss writhed me pretty hard," Andressa teased, and I had to physically restrain myself from rolling my eyes into the back of my head. "If you can hold down a piece like this," Hargreave rumbled, looking at me, "then that's another story." "That's not a nice thing to say, considering I woke up in your apartment this morning," Andressa replied, flashing him a smile that was 90% shark. "I'm pretty sure she just did that to watch me turn a shade of red that would embarrass a sunset." The power of the secretary banter dynamic in this office is honestly stronger than most of the magic I see on a daily basis. Hargreaves' issue was fascinating. He had the yips. The greatest fighter in the arena was suddenly fumbling his weapons like a nervous amateur. He wanted a shortcut, a potion to fix his brain, but I had to play hardball. "I didn't think a champion gladiator would be opposed to a bit of hard work," I said, leaning back. "It was a gamble, but I've learned that these titans respect a little bit of backtalk more than they respect sympathy." He frowned, grumbled, and finally sat up straight. All right. What are these relaxation techniques?" I finished the day exhausted, watching the sun dip behind the spires of Avalon. I've got a wizard trying to raise a magical tornado, a gladiator trying to remember how to hold a sword, and a secretary who spends her downtime leaving cryptic notes on my back and flirting with orcs to see if I'll vaporize. Honestly, I think I need to start charging by the level of stress I experience, rather than by the hour. I might be rich by the end of the week. I thought my days of odd client encounters peaked with a hive mind god who wanted to start a LinkedIn profile, but Oculus proved me wrong. When a man walks into your office flanked by goons and proceeds to narrate his own life as if he's auditioning for a dramatic play about the dark underbelly of the city, you know you're in for a long evening. He wasn't just eccentric. He was genuinely stuck in a villainous monologue feedback loop. Every time he tried to speak, his brain reached for the darkest, most dramatic metaphor available. Asking him about the time of day resulted in a meditation on the nature of light and the crushing weight of reality. Asking him if he was a man resulted in, well, a very specific, very classic gaming reference that I was almost tempted to quote back to him. The goon, bless his heart, was the real translator. He sat there, carefully measuring sugar into his boss's tea, while Oculus rumbled on about the crucible of the underworld and swords forged in fire. I didn't even try to ask for their tea preferences. I just set the whole sugar and cream tray down and hoped for the best. "Is this a yes or a no?" I asked during the tea ritual. "It takes boiling water to bring out its truest flavor." He began. The goon sighed. "The boss will have a cup." It was a masterclass in professional patience. We did role play. We did basic yes/no exercises, and we determined that the man was essentially a victim of his own grind. He hadn't slept in weeks, fueled by alchemical concoctions and a pathological need to maintain his facade as the ultimate criminal mastermind. He'd literally worked his personality into a corner where he couldn't speak without being deep and foreboding. By the end of the session, we reached a breakthrough. He managed to say yes and no without trying to solve the riddle of existence. "I can help you," I told him, "but you have to sleep. You have to take a break." He looked at me with that one red eye, genuinely startled by the concept of leisure time. As they left, he couldn't help himself. He squeezed in one last, crushing bit of wisdom about the world taking everything from you, but he shook my hand firmly. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it, listening to the silence of the office. No mimics, no toddlers, no gladiators, just me, an empty office, and the realization that my job security is currently being provided by the city's most dramatic criminals. I think I'll take that drink now. A stiff one. No metaphor. The walk to the arena felt like being caught in a slow-moving, multi-species migration. I was tucked between a weeping kobold selling tarps, a terrifyingly practical business model, considering the state of the sand, and a sea of people vibrating with a specific, low-frequency hum of bloodlust. I'd brought Eric, my fellow Earth expat. Andressa had given me the cold shoulder all day, which was code for, I am physically incapable of not making you feel guilty, but Eric needed the outing more. Plus, I didn't want Andressa to witness the inevitable moment my stomach decided to protest the spectacle. The arena itself was an architectural marvel, a massive, domed coliseum designed to keep stray spells from vaporizing the neighborhood. We were sat in the VIP section, practically close enough to the sand to get splashed. Eric was in his element, a giant beer in one hand and a bag of peanuts in the other, fitting in perfectly with the local nobility. Then the slaughter started. Madame Guillotine, a woman with a braid of hair longer than my career path and a sword the size of a canoe, faced off against Rocky Stoneman, a dwarf who looked like he'd been carved out of an anvil. It was brutal, theatrical, and to my horror, incredibly well choreographed. Watching Rocky get sliced in two was a close-your-eyes-and-breathe moment for me, but the crowd reacted like they'd just seen a winning touchdown. The kicker? 5 minutes later, a priestess stitched them both back together with threads of light, and they shook hands. It was the most ethical blood sport I'd ever seen. I had to step out for air when a stray tooth landed near my shoe. That's when the Goblin Courier found me. The champ wants to see you. Hargreaves' locker room was marked with a star, and he was already there, looking like a caged mountain. He tried to project confidence, but the yips were clearly chewing him up from the inside. I'm having trouble with the breathing, he admitted, his massive frame slumped over a table. I need to get better. If I lose, I'm a loser. What would happen if you never fought again? I asked. He paused. I'd be a loser. I walked him through it. We chipped away at the prestige, the fans, the ego. It turns out his house wouldn't burn down, his family wouldn't disown him, and his friends wouldn't disappear if he hung up his boots. We reframed the stakes. He wasn't there to win a death match. He was there to put on the greatest show of his life. Your coach told me this. I guess I forgot, he muttered, looking at his calloused, massive hands. It's the same old story, whether you're a gladiator in Avalon or a mid-level manager back on Earth. We get so obsessed with the scoreline that we forget we're the ones holding the sword. Now, I said, pulling up a chair, let's do the exercises together before you go out there. As we sat there, the roar of the crowd filtered through the stone walls, a constant, hungry reminder of what was waiting for him. I didn't care about the outcome of the match, but I cared about his breathing. For the next 10 minutes, the only thing that mattered was the rhythm of his lungs. He wasn't a champion in that room. He was just a man trying to stop his own brain from tripping him up. And for the first time all day, he looked like he might actually win. My morning began under a cloud of professional tension. Andressa was doing the silent treatment, which, knowing her, was either a genuine grudge for being left behind at the arena or a sophisticated way to force me into an awkward conversation. Either way, she'd swapped her signature red pen for silence. The tension was broken by Wea, a Sphinx who was essentially the magical equivalent of a tech support bot that only speaks in riddles. What guards gates? What asks questions that boggle minds? She greeted me. You do, I replied, feeling like I'd just stepped into a high-stakes game of Jeopardy, where the wrong answer could lead to being eaten. She wasn't a bad person, just socially illiterate. She'd spent her life in the Valley of Kings, gatekeeping treasures by threatening to devour anyone who couldn't rhyme. Her attempts at mingling at the Floating Garden and the DMV had ended with her trying to riddle pedestrians into submission and getting the guards called on her. I've dealt with a lot of anxieties, but inability to stop being a mythical monster is a new one. I managed to convince her that a support group game night was a much better venue for her talents than a public street corner. Once she left, the office atmosphere shifted from riddle dungeon to awkward brunch. Mia from the bakery arrived with a dark chocolate cake. Clearly the "I'm sorry you went to the arena without your secretary" peace offering I'd sent word for via the Pixie. It was a triple fork affair. Andressa was still playing the "I'm not mad, I'm just incredibly petty" card, but the cake seemed to be doing the heavy lifting and repairing our dynamic. Then Mia dropped the bomb. She wanted to be my apprentice. I nearly choked on a crumb. I'm not sure it would be possible, I explained, trying to sound as gentle as possible. On Earth, my job requires nearly a decade of schooling and strict licensing. It's a very specific, clinical, and grueling path. Seeing the light fade from Mia's face felt like watching a candle blow out in a drafty room. I've known her since I got here. She's a local fixture, and the idea of her being stuck in a bakery she hates while I bumble through sessions just felt wrong. Let me think about it, I told her. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no that would close the door for good. She brightened, satisfied for the moment, and I went back to my coffee. Then there was Andressa, who took advantage of the distraction to steal a forkful of cake off my plate. She flashed those sharp demon teeth at me with a smirk that told me, quite clearly, that the silence was officially over. She wasn't just hungry, she was asserting dominance. I still have a Sphinx to introduce to a support group, a gladiator who needs to learn how to breathe, and a potential apprentice to consider. I suppose it's time to start looking into what a therapist in training certification looks like in a city built on the bones of giants and the whims of dragons. It's going to be a long month. Avalon's weather is a temperamental beast, but for the first snow of the year, which also happened to be Hollytide, it decided to play nice, settling for a biting, festive chill rather than a spontaneous trauma fog. Hollytide is essentially what happens when every winter holiday in the multiverse gets thrown into a blender. It's chaotic, confusing, and surprisingly delightful. I arrived at the support group space, which had been transformed with glowstones and garlands, feeling a mix of professional pride and a very specific, hollow disappointment. I'd invited Andressa, but the room was full of familiar faces: Eric, Sarah, Ben, and a host of local business owners, without a sign of her. I spent the first hour playing the role of the social glue, catching up with the regulars, and even orchestrating a bit of petty revenge on Ben. He'd shown up with his new partner, Celeste, and when he started prodding me about why my secretary hadn't shown, I casually mentioned to Celeste that Ben was a famous singer back on Earth. Watching him get dragged onto the dance floor to prove it was the highlight of my evening. I had a few too many cups of the dwarvish punch, which is deceptively earthy and far stronger than it tastes, before a tap on my shoulder stopped me mid-sentence. It was Andressa. She looked like she'd spent hours getting ready, from the intricate braid in her hair to the metallic blue lipstick that made my brain go completely blank. I stared for a full minute, and when I finally spoke, I didn't recognize the person behind my own voice. I don't see a reason to wait up for someone that doesn't show up when she says she will. I snapped. The venom of my own words surprised me as much as it shocked her. It was the drink talking, sure, but it was also the pent-up frustration of a week of secret-keeping and casual, professional boundaries. I tried to backtrack, stumbling through a rambling, drunken confession about how I wanted it to be a date, which only made her blush a deeper shade of crimson. She didn't let me sink, though. She just grabbed my hand. "Come on and dance with me." The dance floor was a chaotic tapestry of cross-dimensional styles: Naga line dancing, dwarven mountain stepping, and whatever gyrations the other species were favoring. Andressa took the lead, her grip firm and her heat radiating like a furnace. We moved together, half clumsy and half intoxicated, until the bard song finally faded. That's what she pointed up. Mistletoe. I didn't need to ask for clarification. The tradition was one of the few things that seemed to have crossed the dimensional barrier intact. I didn't hesitate. I pulled her close, and we sank into a kiss that felt like it finally resolved every bit of awkward tension we'd been building since I first hired her. It was Hollytide, it was cold outside, and I was likely going to have a brutal headache in the morning, but standing there under the mistletoe, I decided that this was the one holiday tradition I was perfectly happy to keep. The kiss of blue lipstick on my mug this morning was a lingering souvenir from the night before, a silent reminder that my life has shifted from chaotic to weirdly wonderful. Dating Andressa for the past 2 weeks has been a revelation, though I'm still navigating the transition from a solitary hammock sleeper to someone who actually needs to buy a real bed. I was lost in that happy, stupid mental fog when my office door was unceremoniously kicked open. The intruder was a young man in Victorian formal wear who looked like he'd been bored for a century. He dodged Andressa's tail with the practiced, muscle memory grace of someone who had practiced that exact movement a few thousand times. "Time looper," he announced, cutting me off before I could even get a word in. "I've checked for curses, spells, and deals with the devil. It's just me. I'm the only one in the loop." He wasn't exaggerating. Dugan had lived this day thousands of times. He'd done the dream analysis, he'd helped his golem get citizenship, and he'd heard my spiel on his parents so many times he was practically reciting the script with me. He was a man drowning in his own perfectionism, fueled by cold showers, caffeine, and an absolute, terrifying refusal to stop working. "I think you need to rest," I told him after he'd run through the exhausted catalog of everything he'd tried to break the cycle. He looked at me like I just suggested he set his golem on fire. I won't waste time like that. It was a stalemate. He was so convinced that the solution to his temporal imprisonment was more work, more science, and more frantic activity that he couldn't see the irony of his own situation. He had all the time in the world, yet he was the most time-poor person I'd ever met. He stormed out, tipping his hat to Andressa on his way to go bother a crossroad demon, leaving me alone with the realization that some people have to break themselves over and over again before they're ready to just sit down and breathe. Andressa leaned against her desk, the initial annoyance of the interruption fading into genuine concern. "Were you able to help him?" "I hope so," I sighed. "He thinks he's a scientist stuck in a puzzle. I think he's a man who forgot how to be a human being." She offered a classic Andressa solution, canceling my remaining appointments and christening the new bed, which, alas, hadn't even been delivered yet. I took a rain check, mostly because my patient Nost had missed his meds, but the offer was tempting enough to make me forget about the headache of the time looper for a moment. "We should eat something fatty and terrible for lunch," I suggested. "Deal." I'm currently sitting here waiting for my next client, thinking about Dugan looping through his morning routine of cold showers and oatmeal. It's a strange thing being a therapist in a city where reality itself can decide to hit repeat. I just hope that tonight, when he lays his head down, he finally realizes that doing nothing is the hardest and perhaps most necessary work of all. The office has become a strange, comfortable crossroads of the multiverse. Last night, I saw Radu, a vampire who's traded existential dread for the quiet, rhythmic solace of knitting. Seeing him present me with a fresh croissant, fangs bared in a genuine smile, was the kind of surreal victory that makes this job worth the lack of sleep. It's funny how, in a place like Avalon, the cure for a centuries-old bloodsucker's ennui isn't a magical artifact. It's just a pair of knitting needles and a decent recipe. I woke up this morning on the office couch, courtesy of Andressa, who had tactically woken me up an hour earlier than necessary just to share a breakfast of scones and tea. She's hovering over the apprentice question, and she's right. I'm stalling. Mia is hardworking, bright, and genuinely interested, but there's a part of me, the academic, the product of a rigid credentialed system, that feels like an imposter even attempting to train someone. How do you teach intuition? How do you teach the art of a job that I'm still figuring out day by day? I told Andressa I'd sleep on it one last time. She just gave me that look, the one that sits somewhere between a romantic partner and a predator who knows exactly where the exits are locked. I'm starting to think I'm not getting much sleep tonight, either. The day's professional shift took a turn for the dramatic when Legion High, the young cultivator, returned. He still smells like gunpowder and ego, but there's been a seismic shift in his demeanor. "The last one saved my life," he admitted, his voice tight. It turns out his father's confinement, which he'd sneaked out of, was the only reason he wasn't standing in the middle of a literal war zone where his rival had been butchered. For a guy whose vocabulary usually consists of worm, hovel, and tyrant, that was a massive, vulnerable admission. He didn't come back to brag. He came back because the sudden realization of his own mortality terrified him. "I wish to be more patient," he said, and he looked like he'd rather be eating glass. I opened my notebook, trying to keep a neutral expression. I'm not the type to say "I told you so," even if it's currently the loudest thought in my head. Dealing with a spoiled demigod who is terrified of his own fragility is going to be a long-term project. But he's here, he's listening, and for the first time, he's sitting in my office as a student rather than a conqueror. I think I'm going to tell Mia yes tomorrow morning. If I can help a vampire find peace in a scarf and a tyrant in training find a shred of humility, maybe I'm qualified enough to teach someone how to listen. One last night of indecision, then the real work starts. My morning started with a playful poke from Andressa, a sharp, pointed reminder that my transition from hammock dweller to man with a bed and a girlfriend is still very much a work in progress. It was a nice, light-hearted moment until Ben arrived. Ben is still struggling to reconcile his old life with his new reality, and he showed up sporting a mix of pirate poet chic and some serious emotional immaturity. When he started bragging about his recent dating life, it was all fun and games until he got to the story about Celeste. She was a werewolf, he said, as if that were a reasonable grounds for immediate termination of a relationship. I dumped her. I don't want to be dealing with a woman who turns into a monster like that. The irony was so thick, it practically choked the room. Here was a man who had transmigrated into a fur-covered, tusked beast of a person, complaining about his girlfriend's lycanthropy. I've tried to be the patient guide. I've tried to navigate the professional boundaries of this world, acknowledging that my license is essentially a piece of paper I wrote on in crayon compared to the complex, magical reality of Avalon. But something in me snapped. Ben wasn't just being a jerk. He was being profoundly, inexcusably cruel to someone who had offered him the one thing he'd been begging for: acceptance. I've resolved to be harsher with you, I said, and then I realized I wasn't just talking. I was acting. I didn't reach for a sedative. I didn't reach for a grounding technique. I grabbed a thick stack of medical files, rolled them into a baton, and proceeded to give him the most literal bad dog lesson of his life. I smacked him across the nose. Once. Twice. Every time he tried to protest, I hit him again. By the time I chased him out the front door, he was whimpering like a puppy who just realized he'd made a mess on the carpet. When I turned back, Andressa was standing there with her eyes burning like embers and her skin a deep, terrifying crimson. Nost, my next client, looked on with a mix of confusion and genuine concern. Is that exposure therapy for someone who is afraid of paper? Nost asked. No, I sighed, straightening my jacket. That was an example of someone losing their temper because he didn't take the time to release the tension through open and honest conversation sooner. I sent Nost into the office. The kid is actually doing well, a rare, heartwarming success in a day that had otherwise devolved into physical discipline. Andressa leaned over her desk, looking like she was ready to set the building on fire, but there was a flicker of impressed curiosity in her gaze. Are you going to give me the details? She asked. I don't think I'd be able to keep myself from ranting about it to you one way or the other, I admitted. Good. I look forward to it. I'm sitting in my office now, the silence punctuated only by the distant sounds of Avalon. I'm not proud of the violence. It wasn't clinical, it wasn't professional, and it was certainly a violation of every ethical code I ever studied back home. But for a man who spent months wallowing in self-pity and hurting people to prop up his own fragile ego, sometimes a bad dog smack is exactly the wake-up call the soul needs. Tomorrow is a new day. Maybe I'll even get to sleep in my new bed, if Andressa doesn't set it on fire first. A double date at an Orcish axe-tossing tavern is, predictably, a sensory overload. The place smelled of sawdust, ale, and that specific, sharp metallic tang that comes from weapons sticking into wood, and the walls were adorned with enough lethal steel to arm a small militia. Renee and I were clearly the delicate half of the quartet. While Esme and Andressa were busy turning the target into a pincushion, Renee and I sat at the table, quietly nursing our respective wounds. I'd given Renee a healing potion under the table. He was covered in bruises from Esme's affections, which I didn't feel too bad about considering I was currently sporting my own roadmap of Avalon across my back. She's stronger than I thought she was, Renee murmured, watching Andressa sink an axe into the dead center of the target with an effortless flick of her wrist. Demons are deceptively strong, I replied, suppressing a wince as I took a bite of meat, so heavily spiced it felt like it was trying to cauterize my tongue. People in Avalon tend to forget that when they aren't looking at a monster in little health, The conversation took a turn for the professional when Renee brought up Ben. The guy is apparently still reeling from the bad dog incident, and he's been telling anyone who will listen about his grievances. Renee, being the diplomat he is, suggested I mediate. You yourself advocate talking things out, he reasoned. I was leaning toward it. It's my job, after all, and I'm used to being the one to bridge the gap. But then Andressa jumped in, wiping the spicy sauce from her fingers with a casual burst of hellfire that made the table temperature rise 5 degrees. Just this time, you should wait for him to come to you, she said. It stung to admit she was right. My therapist's brain wants to fix the dynamic to ensure everyone communicates clearly and processes their feelings. But my friend brain, the part of me that is tired of Ben using our relationship as a shield for his own shitty behavior, realized that I'd already laid the groundwork. I told him exactly why he was wrong. If I go back to him now, it just signals that I'll be there to scoop him up every time he hits rock bottom, no matter how much he hurts the people around him. I think you're right, I sighed, pushing away the plate of molten spiced meat before it finished me off. We switched roles after that. The women took over the axe throwing, escalating a friendly competition into something bordering on a blood feud, while Renee and I tried to maintain our dignity on the range. I missed the mark entirely. My axe landed handle first with a dull thunk that made the orc server look over in pity, but Renee managed to sink his with a graceful, two-handed throw that actually earned a nod of respect from the gallery. You may have beaten me, Esme grinned at Andressa, but my man restored my honor. Andressa's tail flicked, a sure sign of her competitive streak. I'm fairly certain he'd need to sink for more axes to restore your honor, Esme. The dwarf's face went a shade of red that matched the paint on Grimner's sign, and she dragged Renee back onto the floor for round 2. I decided to stick to my ale and stay out of the blast zone. There's something peaceful about watching the person you love dominate in axe-throwing range while you nurse a mild stomach burn and realize that, for once, you don't have to be the one to solve everyone's problems. Some things are better left to resolve themselves, or at least resolve themselves through the medium of projectile weaponry. The Grimner Axe Tossers Tavern might be a great place for entertainment, but it is an absolute death trap for the digestive system of someone from Earth. I spent the last 24 hours learning exactly how many ways a human body can stage a protest against heavily spiced meat. I showed up to the support group, meeting feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. My hands were shaking, my voice sounded like it was coming from a different room, and I was pretty sure the only thing keeping me upright was pure, stubborn habit. I'd arrived in a pumpkin carriage because walking felt like an insult to gravity, and I spent the first hour hovering somewhere between consciousness and a fever dream. I was convinced I was playing it cool, but Sarah, bless her, wasn't buying it for a second. Everyone noticed, John, she told me once the meeting wound down. You're 2 shades paler than usual. She was right. I've been so focused on not missing a meeting, the first one I've ever skipped, that I didn't realize the group had essentially been running itself. Sarah had been jumping in to manage the flow, and honestly, she was good at it. She was sharp, empathetic, and had the room's respect. The revelation that I wasn't the only person capable of facilitating the group was both a blow to my ego and a massive weight off my shoulders. You're a bit of a control freak, you know that? She asked. She was right. I'm so used to being the fixer that I've forgotten the goal of the group was to help them become independent, not dependent on me. I stumbled out of the building and caught a ride in a carriage pulled by a headless driver, a fitting metaphor for my current state of mind, and crawled back to my apartment. I expected to find the hallway empty, but Andressa was there, propped against my door, reading a book. I knew you were sick, she said, her expression shifting from concern to a sort of predatory protectiveness. You ran your group in this state? I didn't want to miss it. I muttered, my resistance fading as she unlocked the door and essentially took charge. I'm going to be pampering you and caring for you until you feel better, she announced. When I tried to protest, she just smiled, the sharp-toothed, confident smile that reminds me exactly who she is. I do have to go that far. I need to eat while I'm here, don't I? I'm currently curled up in a new bed, which is a massive improvement over the hammock, even when I'm shivering from a spice-induced fever, listening to her move around the kitchen. It's strange being the one who needs the care. I've spent months being the therapist, the mediator, the guide for every transmigrated soul in Avalon, and here I am, letting someone else hold the reins for once. I think I might actually be able to sleep now. And tomorrow, when I'm not dying of dry toast and exhaustion, I'll have to have a real conversation with Mia about the apprenticeship. But for now, just the quiet, the darkness, and the comforting realization that I'm not the only person who cares about this office. The morning light filtering into my apartment was a welcome sight, mostly because it meant the spiced meat incident was officially behind me. Waking up to find Andressa still asleep on my chest was a far better start to the day than anything I'd experienced in the last 24 hours. After navigating a minor crisis involving cinnamon-flavored dental rinse, an assault in the senses no human should have to endure first thing in the morning, and sharing the shower, we slipped into our roles for the day. I went with a checked suit at her suggestion. She has a better eye for my wardrobe than I do. Will you be staying again tonight? I asked, trying to sound casual, though I knew the answer. Afraid not, she replied. Drinks with some friends visiting from hell. The casual way she says things like that still gives me pause, but it's Avalon. My normal is a city that experiences frequent breaks in reality, like the planets currently visible in the afternoon sky, and a partner who treats a trip to the infernal plains like a happy hour. We made the trek to Hilda's, dodging swooping harpies who were evidently in the middle of their season. Mia was behind the counter, looking like she'd just walked out of a high-concept music video, all pale makeup and black eyeshadow. She beamed when she saw us, and her excitement was infectious. Thanks again for agreeing for me to be your apprentice, she said. I'm going to be flying by the seat of my pants. I warned her honestly. It's one of the weirdest jobs in every dimension. She laughed, but I meant it. Teaching someone the nuances of therapy when your primary tools include a bad dog smack with a stack of papers and cross-dimensional dream analysis is going to be interesting. We talked briefly about her reading, and I had to reassure her that, no, I don't treat every client like they're suffering from an Oedipus complex. We have standards. Back at the office, the transition from boyfriend to therapist happened in the space of a single door unlocking. I left the macaroons on her desk, dropped the bagels on mine, and leaned in for a kiss, only to be pulled back in for a second, firmer one. Who do we have scheduled for today? I asked, trying to reclaim my professional composure. She didn't reach for the calendar. She just kept her grip on my collar. Not sure yet. I haven't exactly been in long enough to check. Well, I said, a smile pulling at my lips. What could have slowed you down? Is something distracting you? She held my gaze, her golden eyes bright and steady. More to someone. I have a full day of sessions ahead. I have an apprentice to mold. I have a time looper who refuses to sleep, a young tyrant in training who is finally learning patience, and a city that likes to sprout new planets in the sky just to keep me on my toes. But for the next 5 minutes, the schedule can wait. Getting ready for the wedding turned into a moment of unexpected vulnerability. I'd spent so long wearing the same green suits that they'd become a sort of uniform, a way to blend into the scenery of my own life. Then Andressa handed me that burgundy suit. It was a masterpiece of tailoring, and the moment I caught my reflection, the sudden flash of déjà vu hit me like a physical blow. It was the same mirror, the same suit-shopping nerves, the same old ghost of a past life trying to crowd into the present. But then I looked at the tie, then at Andressa, and the ghost receded. I wasn't just a man trying on a suit. I was a man living a life that, for all its madness, was entirely my own. The travel to Lendaria was a stark reminder of how weird my normal has become. We boarded a porcelain carriage that felt like it belonged in a fairy tale, and for an hour, we watched Avalon skyline. Then came the transition, that sickening, head-pounding blur that happens when you cross the boundary between worlds. When the world finally stopped spinning, we were in Lendaria. Compared to the kaleidoscopic chaos of Avalon, Lendaria felt almost achingly quiet. The sky was just blue, the clouds didn't have teeth, and the transportation consisted of simple, four-legged animals rather than soul-fueled constructs. It's a bit drab, isn't it? Andressa remarked, looking out at the sleepy, cobblestoned horizon. She wasn't wrong. It lacked the visceral, dangerous beauty of home, or rather, my new home. As we drew closer to Princess Gralia's palace, a massive, blindingly white structure that seemed to be trying to pierce the clouds, I braced myself for the event. "You ready?" I asked, checking my cuffs. "Absolutely," Andressa replied, a flicker of that sharp, hungry glint in her eyes. Few places better to feed than weddings. I shot her a look, and she laughed, quickly adding, "And I also want to support Gralia, Zach, and Carol, of course." I could do both. I let out a breath and offered her my arm. We were headed to a wedding that bridged worlds, featuring a princess and 2 consorts, in a world that was far simpler than the one we usually inhabit. I have my stethoscope in my pocket, just in case, and a pocket full of cooling stones, and a partner who can charm a crowd or hunt it, depending on a mood. It's going to be a long day, but for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm wearing a costume. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The courtyard of Princess Gralia's palace was a masterclass in controlled chaos. One moment, I was nursing a glass of champagne and enjoying the sight of Crush, the Orcish warrior who looked absolutely terrifying in dragonbone formal wear. In the next, I was hit by a wave of nausea, so sharp I nearly buckled. Katrina was there. Seeing her, draped in blue lace and clinging to the arm of a man who looked like he'd been carved out of marble, felt like being sucker-punched by my own past. We exchanged the hollow, polite pleasantries of strangers who once knew everything about each other. It was agonizing. When she finally walked away, I felt like I just stepped out of a vacuum. "Well, that was rude," Andressa whispered. I turned to her and saw the transformation. She wasn't just annoyed, she was incandescent. Her skin was a deep, searing red, and the air around her was shimmering with the heat of her own agitation. My anxiety had become her fuel, and she was currently burning with it. "I'm sorry." I was surprised, I muttered, trying to keep my distance so she wouldn't accidentally set my burgundy suit on fire. "That was Katrina, huh? She almost looks too pretty to have had such a good filing system." The sheer absurdity of the comment, combined with her jealous, protective heat, did more to ground me than any breathing exercise ever could. I couldn't help but laugh, though the sound was a bit brittle. Before she could grill me further, a magically amplified horn blared, signaling the start of the ceremony. We filed into the ballroom, a space so gargantuan and opulent it felt like the ceiling might be in a different dimension entirely. Floating orbs of light danced above us in a synchronized ballet, and the seating seemed to have a mind of its own, steering us effortlessly into the second row, mere feet away from the royalty. As the crowd settled, I spotted them, the families of Zach and Carol. They looked like they were trying to evaporate into their chairs, hunched and stiff in formal clothes that clearly felt like suits of armor to people accustomed to hard labor. They were utterly overwhelmed, their eyes tracking the floating lights with a mixture of terror and wonder. It was a stark contrast to the kings and queens in the front row, who sat with the bored entitlement of people for whom magic is just background noise. The horns sounded again, deeper and more resonant this time. The ballroom fell silent. The wedding was beginning. I leaned back in my seat, the heat radiating from Andressa finally beginning to simmer down into a steady, comforting warmth against my arm. Whatever had happened in the courtyard, whatever ghosts had decided to make an appearance, they had to stay outside. In here, it was all about the future. I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and prepared to watch 3 people bind their lives together under the eyes of their ancestors. The wedding ceremony was, in a word, surreal. There's a specific kind of magic involved when a grand orchestra appears in a cloud of butterflies. But even that spectacle couldn't upstage the moment Zach, Carol, and Gralia stepped into the light. Watching them walk toward the stage was a lesson in intentionality. The way they paced themselves, Zach's measured steps, Carol's delicate glide, Gralia's effortless grace. It was a silent declaration of the equality they were committing to. It was the antithesis of the stuffy, tradition-laden royal weddings I'd read about in history books. This was a mutual, 3-way promise to elevate one another. When they spoke, the tension that had once threatened to tear them apart, the tension I'd worked with them on for months, was entirely gone. They weren't just reciting vows. They were letting go of their old lives. Seeing Carol admit she never imagined leaving her village, and hearing Graylia refuse to treat them as anything less than her equals, hit me harder than I expected. I didn't just feel like a therapist sitting in the second row. I felt like a proud parent watching a complicated, beautiful, and hard-fought victory. Should we take full credit for it? Andressa whispered, her sharp-toothed grin catching the multicolored light from the orbs above. Or only partial? 50%, I joked, grateful that she was keeping things light. I'll take a fifth of the credit. It'll go well with the fifth of vodka I'm about to drink. The moment the king announced the private final stage of the binding, the ballroom erupted into a spectacle of sudden, effortless luxury. One snap of his fingers, and the room transformed from a solemn chamber into a high-octane reception. The singer on stage had shed her dress to reveal crystalline legs and was currently leading a musical act that felt like it had been pulled directly from the wildest dreams of a rave promoter. As we shuffled toward the bar, Andressa's curiosity shifted away from the wedding and back to the ghost that had haunted our afternoon. Is the last step what I think it is? I asked, keeping my voice low. Consummation, yes, she said, her eyes glinting with amusement. Traditionally, it's done with an audience, but I don't think anyone follows tradition in this case. I didn't blink, probably for the best. She took a step closer, her tail curling behind her, her expression unreadable. Oh, you're not just the least bit curious about how the three of them get along together? I shrugged. My professional wall is usually impenetrable where my patients are concerned, but she caught the flicker in my eyes. She's too smart to miss a beat like that. They already talked to you about it, didn't they? Confidential, I said, offering her a smile that was perhaps a little too smug. We were finally next in line at the bar, the scent of expensive spirits and magical nectar heavy in the air. I knew I couldn't dodge the Katrina conversation forever. She had a way of cutting through the noise until I was left with nothing but the truth, and honestly, standing here in a burgundy suit with a woman who understood my chaotic life better than anyone else, I realized I didn't want to hide from her, either. You know, Andressa said, her voice dropping, you never answer my question about Katrina. I sighed, looking at the long row of bottles behind the bar. Drinks first, then we talk. The vodka hit my system with a familiar, searing warmth, acting as the perfect catalyst for the conversation I'd been dreading for months. Sitting there at the table, with the music swirling around us and the dance floor descending into a beautiful, chaotic mosh pit of species, I finally laid it all out. I told her about Katrina. I told her about the breakup, the insecurity, the stupid, stubborn fear that I was just replacing one secretary with another. I expected disappointment, or at the very least, a cool, detached distance. Instead, she laughed. It was a deep, resonant sound that cut through the tavern din, and when the laughter died down, she looked at me with a sincerity that made my professional armor feel completely redundant. John, I don't want to slow down or take a break just because you were nervous, she said, her voice crisp and clear. She didn't offer a platitude. She offered the truth, unfiltered. She didn't care about my past because she was too busy appreciating the man who brought her breakfast and treated her as an equal. I don't need a round the multiverse trip, she added, her eyes softening. If you can manage a trip with me once a year, I'd be happy with that. I think I stopped breathing for a second. The knot of anxiety that had been coiled in my chest since we started dating finally unspooled. We finished our drinks and hit the dance floor, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was performing the role of John the therapist. I was just a guy in a burgundy suit, dancing with a woman who knew exactly how broken I could be and decided to stick around anyway. The rest of the night was a blur of music, buffet food, and shifting partners. I danced with Crush. I swapped a quick spin with Carol and Graylia, who were looking flushed, breathless, and blissfully happy, and I watched Andressa handle a handsy elf with a well-placed elbow to the gut. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, we were exhausted. We found a throuple to say our goodbyes. Zach pulled me aside for a moment, his unassuming smile just as genuine as the day I met him. Would I still be able to see you alone? He asked. I mean, if it's not a bother? Of course, I told him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. The offer is available for all three of you. Watching them, I felt that familiar surge of pride. They had started as a tangled mess of trauma, ambition, and royal duty, and they had fought their way to this moment, a binding that felt both earned and entirely right. The carriage ride back was a quiet blur. I don't remember much past the courtyard, only the weight of Andressa curled against my chest and the steady, rhythmic sound of our breathing. For once, I didn't have a schedule to keep, no patience to untangle, and no secrets left to keep. I just slept, and for the first time in a very long time, it was enough. I feel like I've been hit by a carriage, and not one of the nice porcelain ones from the palace. Staying awake through that seance was one of the hardest things I've done since opening this office. There's a specific kind of professional irony in telling a client that you're suffering from the specter of the Reaper because you're 34 and tired, only to have to turn around and pull an actual, literal specter into the room to deal with his jealousy issues. Using jealousy as a therapeutic tool is messy. I hate playing the role of the other man to bait a ghost out of the ether, but sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to make progress. Watching Nick manifest, sickly green and hovering over the coffee table, was a reminder that for all the magic and dimensions I deal with, human emotions are universal. Dead or alive, a guy who doesn't know how to handle his own insecurities is just a guy who doesn't know how to handle his insecurities. I was incredibly proud of Brenda for sticking it out. It takes a certain kind of courage to look your own ghost in the eye, especially when he's currently ruining your love life from the great beyond. The best part of the night, though, was watching Mia. She didn't complain, she didn't flag, and she was there taking notes the entire time. When we finally wrapped up as the sun was rising, she was sound asleep on my desk with a pool of drool that I'll be cleaning up later. Watching her, I realized that for all the years I've spent trying to fix people in this city, the most important thing I can do is pass that along. Therapy is a lot of going in circles, talking, stalling, avoiding the real hurt, but you have to let the client walk those circles until they're ready to find the exit. I'm walking her across the street to her mother's now. I think I've earned a nap. And honestly, I think I've earned a day where nothing, not a ghost, not a prince, not even an apprentice, needs me to be anything other than someone who is ready to sleep for 10 hours straight. It's been a long week, but the work is good, and for once, the office is quiet. That's enough. The mating season in Avalon turns the city into a theater of the absurd, and today was no exception. Between dodging swooping harpies who have an unfortunate and vocal appreciation for my red hair and navigating the emotional fallout of a Sphinx's dungeon mastering, my capacity for normal is being tested. Mia was a highlight, though. Her progress in social integration is heartening. Even if she's struggling to moderate her tendency to turn therapy sessions into riddle-based encounters. Seeing her find a community through gaming, even if she's an absolute menace to her players as a DM, is exactly why I do this. Then came Erda Ironroot. I've learned to recognize the specific brand of pining that comes from two people who are terrified of their own intensity. When Erda sat on my couch, looking like she'd been forged in a volcano and describing her attraction to Avalon as if it were a tactical combat scenario, it felt like déjà vu. I'd already heard the L side of this story from Avalon's own frantic, obsessed monologues. Directly encouraging a dwarf to have it out with an elf is probably not in any standard psychiatric textbook, but in a city where reality breaks during the afternoon and soul bonds are common, sometimes direct action is the most clinical approach. "You're bad," Andressa teased, leaning against the doorframe as Erda stomped out to find Avalon. "You know, Avalon's just as obsessed with her. They're going to tear each other apart. Did I tell you about Avalon?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, but he never stopped talking about her when he was in the waiting room. I suppose I am getting more direct. Maybe it is the demonic influence. Or maybe I'm just tired of watching people dance around their own happiness because they're afraid of the friction. If they tear each other apart, they'll do it with passion, and honestly, in a city this strange, that's as good a foundation as any. The evening was a rare, quiet anchor. Avalon's streets were alive with the desperate, musical mating calls of bird folk and the terrifyingly beautiful sight of dragons nearly colliding in the sky. But inside, it was just us. I watched Andressa drift off, her horns barely visible against the pillow, the ambient heat of her body making the cold night air feel irrelevant. I've spent my life as the neutral observer, the one who watches others build their lives while I manage the scaffolding. But somewhere along the line, between the burgundy suits, the chaotic support groups, and the quiet moments in this room, the scaffolding became a home. "I love you," I whispered, the words feeling smaller and more profound than any theory I've ever studied. She didn't wake, just shifted closer, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next crisis. I was just there in the quiet, finally catching up to the life I'd been helping everyone else build. The kobold barbecue intervention with Ben was exactly what we both needed. It was 10 in the morning, which is a frankly ungodly hour for a pile of ribs, but as Ben sat there, sans his ego and his formal wear, I realized how much I'd missed our dynamic. He owned up to his behavior with Celeste, he did the work to reconcile with her, and most importantly, he showed up. We reached a new baseline, friends, but with a firm agreement to call each other out when we're being bullshit. He even pitched a Boyz Night, which I'm still cautiously optimistic about, provided we don't end up in the arena getting pulverized by his 8-foot frame. But as the day waned, my focus shifted to the real challenge: dinner in Little Hell with Andressa's friends. I dressed carefully, opting for the burgundy suit she'd given me. If I'm going to the belly of the beast, quite literally, I might as well look the part. I flagged down a kite and wagon driven by a nightmarish, Geiger-esque version of Jiminy Cricket and let it ferry me toward the city's infernal district. The commute provided a front-row seat to Avalon's current, pollen-heavy, and aggressively romantic state of affairs. Trans were essentially broadcasting their reproductive intentions in public, and the streets were a chaotic pageant of courtship. I've lived here long enough that I don't flinch at much, but Little Hell has a specific, stifling atmosphere that's hard to ignore. The thermal vents hummed with a constant, oppressive heat, and the shops catering to the local succubi population were doing a brisk trade. As I walked toward the last meal, I could feel the local gaze. It wasn't the polite indifference of the city center. Here, the interest was predatory, hungry, and uncomfortably direct. I got a few catcalls, which I managed to handle with the same detached flattery I'd used on the harpies earlier that day. I'm standing outside the entrance now, adjusting my cuffs, and try to remind myself that I'm a therapist who holds his own against vampires and interdimensional threats. If I can survive a session with a jealous ghost, I can certainly survive a dinner with Andressa's inner circle. I just hope imitation human flesh isn't the house specialty. I took one last steadying breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. It's time to see who exactly Andressa considers friends. The last meal was exactly the kind of sensory overload I've come to expect from Little Hell. Between the Neon Reaper signage, the ambient hellfire, and the waitstaff who seemed to view me as a fresh recruit for the slaughter, the atmosphere was perfectly balanced between terrifying and oddly comfortable. Meeting Grimm and Beals felt less like a double date and more like a high-stakes interview. Grimm, the incubus, was all jagged edges and acidic wit, while Beals, despite the writhing mass of roaches disguised as a hand, was surprisingly clinical about the logistics of damnation. It's a strange thing, sitting across from a creature whose job is to optimize torture, yet finding her more thoughtful than half the people I encounter in the office. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut. I could tell Grimm and Beals were testing me, probing for weaknesses, and I did my best to stick to my professional baseline. Remain polite, keep my cool, and don't let the hellfire get to me. When the conversation turned to my work, I stood by my conviction. Yes, the scale of suffering is vast. I know that better than anyone, but the individual counts. Helping one person is worth the effort, even if the queue of the damned never ends. I didn't realize how much Andressa was doing for me until the walk back. I caught snippets of their exchange as I walked ahead to flag a carriage. They were poking at me, questioning my intelligence, and generally trying to rattle her. She wasn't having it. Hearing her stand up to her oldest friends, calling them out for their behavior while I was standing right there, made the entire evening feel like a victory. Back in the carriage, the air was cooler and the oppressive heat of the district was fading. She leaned into me, looking tired but fiercely protective. I decided not to mention that I'd heard her chew them out. There's something to be said for letting the person you love have their own battles, and she'd clearly fought this one on my behalf. I just pulled her closer, the soft scent of brimstone and her own familiar warmth grounding me. "Everything okay?" I asked softly, though I already knew the answer. She didn't need to explain. She just kissed me, a long, lingering acknowledgement of the fact that we'd survived the gauntlet. "We're going home now, back to a quiet apartment, far away from hellfire and optimized torment. I think I'll make coffee when we get back, the regular kind, with no hellfire, no roaches, and absolutely no need to prove myself to anyone. I'm exactly where I want to be, dealing with a doppelganger, especially one that looks, sounds, and acts exactly like you, is a level of surrealism I usually save for the after-hour sessions." But as I sat across from myself, watching my own mannerisms played back like a performance, I realized the irony. I had been spending so much time fixing others that I'd forgotten how much of my own growth was still a work in progress. When we switched places and I took the couch, it felt less like a prank and more like a necessary confrontation. Hearing him describe his imposter syndrome, that hollow feeling of being nothing more than a collage of stolen traits, struck a nerve. We all borrow, don't we? We inherit our parents' quirks, we mirror our friends' speech patterns, and we build our identities out of the scraps we pick up from the people we admire or fear. The fact that he did it literally as a fey changeling was just a more extreme version of the human condition. You may not have any specifically unique traits, but you yourself are unique for their combination, I told him. Seeing my own face contemplate that was a strange kind of therapy. It was a reminder that authenticity isn't about being original from thin air. It's about how we integrate the pieces we've gathered along the way. He still had more to unpack regarding the social pressures of the Phalanx and the secrecy he felt forced to maintain. As he started to open up about the necessity of his deception, I realized the clock was ticking. My actual first patient of the day would be arriving at any moment. "I'm concerned that if the summer court finds out I'm broken, they'll just discard me," he admitted, his voice quiet, lacking the performative edge he'd used earlier. "I'm a tool to them. If the tool starts having an existential crisis, they don't fix it. They replace it." I nodded, making a mental note to adjust the schedule. If he was going to continue coming here, and he needed to, we had to be careful. "We'll manage it," I assured him, keeping my voice steady. "But we have to work on your safety. If you're going to keep sneaking in here, you can't just rely on mischief as a cover. We need a more sustainable plan." Before he could respond, I heard the faint, telltale sound of the office door opening. My first actual client of the day had arrived. I looked at my double, then at the door, and then back at my own face. "Look," I whispered quickly. "The session is over for now. Come back on Tuesday after hours. And for heaven's sake, try to practice being you for a while, even if it's just in the mirror. See if you can find the person who's holding all those pieces together." He nodded, gave me one last, lingering look of genuine uncertainty, and then, with a shimmer of glamour, he wasn't John anymore. He was someone else entirely, blending into the background of the office just as the door swung open. I stood up, smoothed my suit, and forced a professional smile. "Good morning," I said to my actual client, my heart still racing from the weirdest 10 minutes of my career. "Please have a seat. Let's get started." The spectacle of Boyz Night was exactly as absurd as I'd feared, yet somehow completely endearing. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be riding in a flame-decaled carriage, wearing a neon green Boyz Night shirt, and heading to an elven-themed Hooters with an orc, a Frenchman, and a pest control specialist, I would have checked myself into my own office. But as I stood there in the center of the arena, the air humming with the roar of thousands of ephemeral, cheering ghosts, I realized I didn't hate it. The restaurant, elitarized jugs, was a masterpiece of pandering, but the food was legitimately high tier. Eating cockatrice wings and drake steaks with Ben and the others, I stopped trying to be the therapist and just became one of the guys. Renee was surprisingly game for the whole experience, and seeing Eric, who usually spends his time worried about grubs and gremlins, glow with genuine excitement was worth the price of admission. Then came the arena. Hargreave, my Orsish patient, had pulled strings to give us the gladiator treatment. Standing on that vast, empty floor, then suddenly having the stands erupt with thousands of cheering, translucent phantoms, was an adrenaline spike I hadn't expected. The enemies were clearly tuned down, practically training dummies, but the atmosphere was absolute electric. "This is a training method gladiators use," Hargreave shouted over the synthetic roar of the crowd. I looked at the weapon pile. A trident, a few short swords, some shields. It was essentially a high-budget, magically assisted LARP session. I should have felt foolish. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation. My life for the last few years has been about control, managing my schedule, managing my patience, managing my internal state. Here, in the center of the arena, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the trident in my hand and the way the air shifted when one of the ghosts swung a dull, practiced blade in my direction. "You ready, John?" Ben boomed, his massive frame already shifting into a combat stance. I gripped the trident, feeling the balance of it. The phantom crowd hit a crescendo, and for a moment, I didn't think about the office, the trauma, or even Katrina. I just watched a translucent goblin charge toward me, raised my shield, and grinned. "Let's see what this thing can do," I said. It was time to see if the therapist had any fight left in him. Waking up the next morning or afternoon, given the way the light filtered through the apartment, felt like someone had replaced my brain with warm, soggy cardboard. My head was pounding, a souvenir from the arena's favorite wine. But for the first time in a long time, the ache didn't carry the weight of a patient crisis or an existential dread. The night had been a blur of fried drake wings, ridiculous camaraderie, and the strange, primal satisfaction of swinging a trident at phantom gladiators. It was the furthest thing from therapeutic I could imagine, yet that was exactly why it worked. Andressa was there when I got home, and as usual, she cut through my bleary-eyed nonsense with surgical precision. She knew exactly what elitarized jugs was, and she didn't even have to tease me. Her knowing smile said more than any joke could. She'd handled the cleanup, the shower, the water, the teeth-cleaning potion, with the kind of casual efficiency that made me realize, yet again, how lucky I was that this demoness decided to stick around. Laying there in bed, draped over her, the contrast between the gladiator John of the arena and the man who was currently struggling to keep his eyes open was almost comical. "And do you still feel manly now that you smell like lavender and are laying in a soft bed?" she asked, her voice rich with that dry, demonic humor. "I absolutely do," I mumbled. I was too tired to even attempt to be clever. The Boyz Night had been a success, not because we changed the world or solved any deep-seated trauma, but because we just existed together. No clinical distance, no professional facade, just four guys in neon shirts realizing that even when you're an adult with responsibilities, sometimes you just need to act like a complete idiot for a few hours. I felt her fingers threading through my hair, a steady, rhythmic motion that pulled the remaining tension from my shoulders. The darkness was closing in, that heavy, velvet sleep that only comes after true exhaustion. Then her voice drifted down, quiet and barely there. "Now it's my turn to tell you I love you when I think you're asleep." I felt her squeeze, an embrace that was somehow both delicate and impossibly strong. I wanted to tell her I wasn't asleep yet. I wanted to tell her that I'd heard her, and that I loved her too, and that the Boyz Night was just a night, but she was the life. But the words were too heavy to lift. The warmth of her chest against my head was the only thing I needed to hold on to as I slipped under. For the first time in years, I didn't worry about what the next day would bring. I just let go. The walk back to the apartment felt lighter than any I've taken in the city. Seeing Nost walk out that door, no longer the terrified creature hiding under coffee tables, but a man who had reclaimed his life, was the kind of win that makes the long hours, the ghosts, and the constant emotional labor worth every second. And then Andressa dropped the invitation. Going to hell isn't exactly on the standard romantic getaway list for most therapists, but then again, my girlfriend is a demoness, my apprentice is a demon in training, and my most successful patient was a dwarf with a fear of the sky. Normal left the building a long time ago. "I'll go to hell," I'd said. It was one of the easiest decisions I've ever made, which probably says something profound or deeply concerning about my mental state. As we reached the apartment tree, I caught a glimpse of our reflections in a shop window. A man in a burgundy suit and a demoness with sharp teeth and a tail, holding hands in the middle of a city where the sky is full of dragons and mating harpies. I used to feel like I was just the guy managing the scaffolding of other people's lives. But standing there, knowing I have a trip to the infernal planes ahead of me, I realize I'm not just managing the structure anymore. I'm living in it. I looked at her, still carrying that rare, genuine touch of worry in her eyes, and squeezed her hand. I'm serious, I added, stepping into the shade of the tree. If I can't survive a dinner with Grimm and Beals and a doppelganger session before my first cup of coffee, I think I can handle your family. She laughed, a sound that still has the power to cut through any lingering professional armor I might try to wear. You're going to regret saying that when you see the humidity levels, she teased, though she leaned into me, the familiar heat radiating from her. I'm looking forward to the challenge. I've spent years helping others navigate their own personal hells. I suppose it's only fair that I see where hers is actually located. And for the first time, I don't feel like I'm just an observer. I'm a participant. Whatever happens in the next few weeks, I'm ready. I think I've earned a bit of excitement, as long as it doesn't involve any more surprise doppelgangers. The hourglass schedule, doubling my patient load before a trip to hell, was in retrospect a form of masochism. But looking back at the day, it was the kind of chaos that makes this job so strange and occasionally rewarding. The day was a spectrum of the bizarre. Li Jinhai is still trying to figure out how to navigate his father's new concubine without resorting to feudal violence. And Sabbath and Roderick are learning the terrifying truth that a relationship without constant kidnapping and peril is, well, dull. It was a relief to hear that they were actually considering hobbies rather than high-stakes rescue missions. Wea is thriving with her bar trivia nights. It's amazing what a little social integration can do for a Sphinx with an addiction to riddles. I even had a moment of grace. Christoph, one of the few adventurers who actually made the transition to normal life, showed up with a one-way ticket back to Earth in the form of a blue marble. It's a powerful tool, one that I have to weigh carefully against my patient list. Someone like Jake Onesa is a candidate, but I have to play the long game. The responsibility of choosing who gets to go home is heavy, but it's a burden I'm happy to carry. Then there was Radu. I'd hoped that joining a local crochet group would help him find some gentle, human-centric connection to ease his centuries-long ennui. Instead, he's found a group of elderly socialites whose brand of kind cruelty is so sophisticated it makes vampire court politics look like amateur hour. He's stimulated, he's satisfied, and he's seemingly abandoned his existential despair, all because he's found a group of women who can weaponize a knitting pattern. I'm not sure if I should be proud of the therapeutic breakthrough or worried about the group of grannies he's currently corrupted. I was bone-tired when I finally walked out of the office. The air in the city was quiet, save for the distant hum of the thermal vents from Little Hell. Andressa was asleep at her desk, a small, tired silhouette against the backdrop of the office files. I woke her with a kiss, and we walked home in a silence that felt earned. As I lay in bed, the soft, floral-patterned scarf Radu gifted me folded over the chair. I realized that for all the fatigue and the emotional heavy lifting, I wouldn't trade this. I'm exhausted. I'm leaving for the infernal plains in a week, and I still have a pile of work to finish. But for the first time in a long time, the pieces feel like they're fitting together. I'm ready for the next step. Hell, here we come. The walk to the Hellmouth felt like the final act of a very long, very strange play. Seeing that biplane bank through the Avalon sky, trailing a "Have a Nice Trip" banner, was the kind of absurd, heartfelt gesture that only this city could produce. It was classic Renee, quiet, thoughtful, and just eccentric enough to make me laugh despite the butterflies in my stomach. Leaving the apartment was harder than I expected. That space has been the one constant in my life since I arrived. The quiet, leafy anchor in a world that shifts its geography on a whim. Touching the wall as I left felt less like closing a door and more like making a promise to myself. This isn't an escape, it's a detour. standing in front of the Hellmouth with Andressa, the fire of the portal dancing in her eyes. The last of my tension finally gave way. I've spent years trying to organize the chaos of Avalon, trying to provide a structure for the broken, the lost, and the otherworldly. But today, I'm the one stepping into the unknown. I'm going to meet her family, see the landscape that forged her, and for a few weeks, live in a version of reality that doesn't include my office, my morning bagels, or my support group. It's terrifying, but looking at Andressa, who walked to the front of the line like she owned the place, the crowd parting for her with an instinctive, fearful respect, I realize I'm in the best possible company. Well, I said, my voice steady for the first time all day. Let's go to hell. She squeezed my hand, a silent vow of partnership, and we stepped through the fire. The transition wasn't like a cold draft or a sudden shift in pressure. It felt like stepping from a bright, noisy street into a quiet, warm room. When the flames faded, I wasn't looking at the gray, bustling streets of Little Hell anymore. I was standing on a ridge overlooking a vast, shimmering landscape of obsidian plains and rivers of magma that glowed like molten jewels. It was beautiful, dangerous, and utterly alien. I looked down at my linen shirt, then at Andressa, who was already scanning the horizon with a look of predatory nostalgia. "Welcome home," I whispered. She turned to me, her sharp teeth bared in a grin that was half warning, half welcome. "Don't get too comfortable, John. The fun is just starting." I took a breath of the sulfur-tinged air. It was sharp, heavy, and real. I'm a long way from my hammock, my mystery novels, and my schedule. But for the first time in a long time, I don't have a patient to treat, a crisis to manage, or a secret to keep. I'm just here. And for now, that's enough.